She arrived in a wedding dress she sewed with her own hands. 4 months of stitching by oil lamp, 4 months of believing a man's word was solid enough to build a life on. She stepped off the train in the middle of a Montana blizzard in 1883, expecting a husband, a home, a new beginning. Instead, she found an empty platform, a town that looked away, and the particular cold that gets inside you and tells you the truth about how alone you really are. The man who had written her 17 letters had already married someone else. He hadn't bothered to say so. She stood there in that dress with $4 in her pocket and nowhere to go. And not one person in Harlan Creek stepped forward to help. She was almost dead when a widowed rancher and his 7-year-old daughter found her. The little girl looked up at her father and whispered, "Daddy, she looks like Mama." What happened next would change all three of their lives forever. If this story moves you, hit like and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Follow the channel so you don't miss what comes next. The train did not slow gently into Harlan Creek. It groaned and shuddered like something dying, the brakes releasing a sound that tore through the gray morning air and scattered the few pigeons huddled under the station eaves. Steam billowed thick and white, swallowing the platform whole for a moment, and then it thinned. And there she was. Evelyn Mercer stepped down from the last passenger car in a wedding dress, not because she'd just been married, because she had expected to be. The dress was cream-colored wool, not silk. Silk would have been foolish in a Montana winter, and Evelyn had never been a foolish woman. She'd sewn every stitch herself over 4 months in her cousin's back bedroom in Cincinnati, working by oil lamp until her fingers ached, until the seams were straight and the collar lay flat the way she'd pictured it 100 times. It wasn't the dress of a wealthy woman. It was the dress of a careful one, a woman who believed that if you put enough care into something, it would hold. She believed a lot of things back then. The station master, a heavy-set man named Gruber, who had worked the Harlan Creek platform for 11 years without once being surprised by anything, looked at her from beneath the brim of his cap and then looked away. Not in embarrassment. In the way men look away from something they'd rather not be responsible for. Evelyn set her carpet bag down on the wooden planks and looked up and down the length of the platform. Empty. Not entirely. There was a woman near the far end with a market basket and 2 ranch hands smoking against the wall, and a boy of maybe 12 sweeping snow off the bench nearest the ticket window. But none of them were Douglas Hale. None of them were the man who had written her 17 letters over the course of 8 months, the man who had described his ranch in the Bitterroot foothills as though it were a small kingdom, the man who had said, in his careful, slanted handwriting, "I am not a man given to poetry, Miss Mercer, but I believe you are precisely what this place has been missing." She had read that sentence so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. "Excuse me," she said to Gruber, who was already retreating toward the warmth of his office. "I'm looking for Douglas Hale. He was supposed to meet this train." Gruber stopped. He turned back slowly, the way a man turns when he's been hoping he won't have to speak. "Hale," he said flatly. "Yes, Douglas Hale. He ranches about 12 miles north of town. He wrote that it was 12 miles, near the Cutler Creek Fork. I know where Hale ranches." Gruber pulled the brim of his cap down slightly, a gesture that seemed more defensive than practical. "Miss, are you the woman he wrote for? From back east?" "From Cincinnati, yes. We've been corresponding since March. He proposed by letter in August, and I—" She paused. The way he was looking at her had begun to work its way under her skin like a splinter. "Is something wrong? Has there been an accident?" "No accident." "Then where is he?" Gruber exhaled through his nose and glanced briefly at the 2 ranch hands, who had both stopped pretending to smoke and were watching openly now. "Douglas Hale got married 6 weeks ago," he said, "to a woman named Clara Finch from over in Billings. They had the wedding at the church on a Saturday. Half the town was there. The wind came off the mountains in a long, slow push, and Evelyn felt it move through the wool of her dress as though the fabric wasn't there. "That's not possible," she said. Not because she disbelieved him. She said it because the alternative, that she did believe him, was too large to absorb standing upright on a train platform. "I'm sorry," Gruber said, and he sounded like a man who was sorry, in the particular way that men are sorry about things they had no hand in and intend to keep no hand in. "You'll want to talk to someone at the hotel. Mrs. Purdy runs it. She'll help you sort out what to do next." "I have $4, Evelyn said. Her voice came out very quiet and very even. "And my return ticket is for 6 months from now because Mr. Hale suggested I wouldn't want to leave before spring." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I don't have money for a hotel." Gruber looked at her. Then he looked at the ground. Then he went inside. The ranch hands drifted back to their conversation. The woman with the market basket walked past without making eye contact. The boy with the broom swept the same strip of snow 3 times in a row. Evelyn sat down on the bench. She set her carpet bag between her feet and folded her hands in her lap and looked out at Harlan Creek, Montana. The handful of buildings huddled against the white, the smoke rising from chimneys that belonged to people who had somewhere to be. The mountains beyond the rooftops, so vast and indifferent, they made everything beneath them seem temporary. She had given up her position at the milliner's shop. She had paid her cousin 6 months of the room rent she owed and apologized for leaving. She had sold 2 pieces of her mother's jewelry to cover the train fare, kept the brooch, sold the earrings, because she'd thought she wouldn't need much money once she arrived. She sat on that bench and the wind blew and she did not cry. Not because she was strong, because she was too far past surprise to find the starting place for tears. Opasi. The afternoon came down cold and gray and serious. By 2 o'clock, Evelyn had walked twice through the main street of Harlan Creek, learned that the general store did not offer credit to strangers, and established that the woman who ran the town's only boarding house, a Mrs. Purdy, as Gruber had said, was sympathetic but pragmatic. The room was 50 cents a night. She could not extend credit. She was sorry, she really was, but she had her own situation to consider. Evelyn spent 3 of her $4 on a room for 6 nights. She told herself this was sensible. 6 nights was enough time to find work, to write a letter, to come up with something. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in Mrs. Purdy's back room and unfolded the most recent of Douglas Hale's letters, the one from October, the one that said he was counting the weeks, and that he'd have the spare room made up, and that his foreman's wife had agreed to help her settle in. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along the original creases and put it back in her bag. She did not go looking for Douglas Hale. She told herself this was dignity, and perhaps it was. Perhaps it was also the knowledge that there was nothing to find. That whatever she'd believed about the man who wrote those letters, and the man who had quietly married someone else while she was still stitching her wedding dress, those 2 men were not the same, and the one she'd fallen for had never existed. On the 4th day, she found a woman named Agnes Coulter, who owned the dry goods store and who needed someone to help with inventory. The pay was 50 cents a day. It wasn't enough. Agnes was kind and offered her tea in the morning and did not ask questions about the wedding dress, which Evelyn had folded to the bottom of the carpet bag and not touched again. She let Evelyn come in at 7 and go home at 4, and kept the stove in the back of the shop burning hot, which mattered more than Evelyn admitted. She had started to believe, quietly and tentatively, that she might thread her way through this. Then the blizzard came. It came on a Wednesday, the way Montana storms come, not all at once, but with a kind of gathering intention, the sky dropping lower and lower through the morning hours, until by noon it was sitting on the rooftops. Agnes sent Evelyn home at 2 o'clock with an apology and a wrapped piece of cornbread, and said she thought it best that everyone get where they were going before the worst of it hit. Evelyn walked back toward Mrs. Purdy's. She was 3 blocks from the boarding house when she realized she had left her bag at the shop. The carpet bag, with the last of her money and Douglas's letters, and the picture of her mother tucked in the inner pocket. She went back. Agnes had already locked up and gone. The front door was bolted. Evelyn went around to the back, to the loading entrance she knew Agnes sometimes left unlatched, and it was... She got her bag. She stood in the back doorway of the dry goods store and looked at the sky, and she understood that she had miscalculated. The storm had not waited. It was already serious. Wind driving snow sideways. The street ahead a moving white wall that swallowed the buildings at its edges. She pulled her coat tighter. She had a good coat, at least. Wool, long, with a wide collar she could turn up around her ears. She'd bought it in Cincinnati with her employer's discount, and it was the warmest thing she owned. She started walking. She made it 1 block, maybe a block and a half. Then the wind shifted and came at her full force, and she stopped because she literally could not move forward against it. She stood braced with her carpet bag held against her chest, and her eyes reduced to slits, and she could not see the building in front of her. She could not see the building she'd just left. She could see maybe 6 feet in any direction, all of it white, and the cold was a specific, dangerous kind that got inside her coat, and her boots, and her gloves, with a speed that told her something serious was happening to her body. She got turned around. She still didn't know exactly how. She stepped sideways out of the wind's direct path and lost her orientation, and when she moved forward, she was moving parallel to the street instead of along it, and then she stumbled on something, a step, a curb, she never found out, and went down on one knee in the snow and couldn't find her carpet bag because the wind had taken it 3 feet to her left, and she couldn't see 3 feet to her left. She found the bag. She stood back up. She moved forward because moving forward was all she knew to do. The train platform was there when she stopped. She'd walked in a full arc back to where she'd started, back to the station where no one had helped her 6 days ago. The platform roof gave her a strip of shelter from the direct wind. She pressed herself against the station wall and felt her legs shaking. Not from cold, not yet, though that was coming. From exertion, from the specific exhaustion of fighting weather that is stronger than you. She sat down against the wall. The wind howled over the edge of the roof and scattered snow across the platform planks. The light was going. It was maybe 4 in the afternoon, and the light was going like someone pulling down a shade. Evelyn sat in her good wool coat and her wedding dress folded in her carpet bag, and she understood, with the plain, flat clarity that extreme cold produces, that she was in genuine danger, that no one knew she was here, that if she sat here long enough, the cold would win. She thought about standing back up. Her legs did not cooperate. Caleb Ashford had not planned to be in town that day. He'd planned to be home, battening down the barn and making sure the stock was secured and the pipes in the root cellar were wrapped, all the 100 things that need doing before a Montana storm. He'd planned to be home because his daughter was there with only old Marta watching her, and Rose was 7 and had a habit of following the barn cats into places she wasn't supposed to go, and Marta was 63 and moved slowly and couldn't always keep up. But he'd run out of the wire staples he needed for the fence repair, and fence repair that didn't get done was stock that walked off his land in the spring, and so he'd hitched the mare to the wagon and come into town at 11 that morning thinking he'd be back by 1. By 1, the sky had started to mean business, and he'd spent another hour and a half at the feed store talking through what he was going to do about the north pasture with a neighbor who had no more idea than he did, but who needed to talk anyway. By the time he actually left town, the storm was fully present, and he was moving slower than he wanted to, and Rose was on his mind. He had Rose with him. He'd forgotten to say that. She'd come because she'd heard him say town and had appeared at the wagon wearing her boots and her coat with a look on her face that did not invite argument, and he'd given up. She was beside him on the wagon seat, wrapped in the big driving blanket, watching the storm build the way children watch weather, with a mixture of interest and zero concept of its actual implications. "We should hurry," she said, when they were still 2 blocks from the station road. "We're hurrying," Caleb said. "Duke doesn't look like he's hurrying." Duke is 13 years old, and he's hauling 2 people and 100 pounds of wire staples. He's doing his best. Rose considered this. He's walking like Marta walks. Don't let Marta hear you say that. They came alongside the train platform, and Duke slowed on his own, the way horses slow when they've noticed something a human hasn't yet. Caleb looked. There was a woman sitting against the station wall. She was very still, too still for someone sitting outside in a blizzard. The particular stillness of someone who has stopped fighting and hasn't decided yet what comes next. She was wearing a coat, good one by the look of it, but her hands were bare. He could see that even from the wagon. Her face was turned slightly down. She had snow in her hair. "Daddy?" Rose said quietly, tugging his sleeve. "There's someone over there." "I see her. She's not moving." "I see that too." He pulled Duke up and set the brake and climbed down, and Rose was already climbing down behind him before he could say anything about staying put. He crossed the platform in 6 steps. "Ma'am?" Nothing. He crouched down in front of her. Up close she was younger than he'd thought, mid-20s maybe, dark hair coming loose from whatever she'd had it pinned in, lips going the wrong color. Her eyes were open, and that was something. She looked at him with a kind of detached confusion, like a person translating from a language they half remembered. "You need to get up," he said. "Right now. This isn't a situation you want to stay in." "I know," she said. Her voice came out thin. I've been trying to tell myself that. Can you stand? I'm not sure. He put his hand under her arm and she made an effort, a real one, and together they got her to her feet. She was shaking badly now, which was something, meant the cold hadn't gotten all the way in yet. He kept hold of her arm. Is there someone coming for you? Husband? Family? No. She said it without inflection. No one's coming. He looked at her. She was wearing what appeared to be a wedding dress under her coat. He caught a glimpse of cream-colored wool at the collar, the shaped waist of something that wasn't a house dress. He didn't ask. Whatever the story was, it could wait. I've got a wagon, he said. I'm going home. You can come or you can stay here, but if you stay here, you need to understand what's going to happen. I understand, she said. Good. Can you walk to the wagon? She walked to the wagon, slowly and with his hand still under her arm, but she walked. Rose had already climbed back in and was holding one end of the driving blanket out like an offering. The woman stopped when she saw her. Just for a moment, just a half second, something crossing her face that Caleb couldn't name. Hello, the girl said very seriously. Hello, the woman said. I'm Rose. I'm 7. You can share my blanket. They got her up into the wagon. Caleb climbed in, clicked Duke forward, and they moved out into the white. Rose tucked the blanket around the woman's hands without being asked. She was quiet for a moment, studying the woman's face with the unself-conscious frankness of children who haven't learned yet to pretend they aren't looking. Then she said very softly, so that only her father heard, Daddy, she looks like Mama. Caleb heard it. He didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins, and he thought about what it meant that a 7-year-old had said that, and what it meant that he'd noticed it too. The woman's name, it turned out, was Evelyn. She told him when they were halfway home, the storm thick around the wagon and Duke, picking his way carefully along the road he'd traveled 1,000 times. Evelyn Mercer, she said, from Cincinnati. I came out here to... She stopped. Started again. I was supposed to get married. The man I was supposed to marry had already married someone else. She said it very flatly, the way a person states facts they've finished being shocked by. I've been here 6 days. I couldn't get home because I didn't have money for the fare, and I was working at the dry goods store trying to earn enough, and I went back for my bag and got turned around in the storm. Agnes Coulter's store? Caleb said. Yes. He nodded. He didn't say anything for a while. The man who left you, he said. Hale? She turned to look at him. You knew? Harlan Creek's not a big town. He kept his eyes on the road. I heard he had someone coming. Heard he'd married Clara Finch about the same time I heard that. He paused. I thought someone would have, I don't know, sent word. No one sent word, Evelyn said. He had nothing to say to that wasn't inadequate, so he said nothing. Rose had fallen asleep between them, her head listing against Evelyn's arm. Evelyn had gone very still when it happened, like a person who was afraid to move and disturb something fragile. Well, the ranch was dark when they came up the track, just the light from the kitchen window and the barn lamp swinging in the wind. Old Marta met them at the door with an oil lamp held high and an expression that cycled rapidly through relief, confusion, and a careful neutrality that Caleb recognized as her version of keeping her opinions to herself. She needs warming up, he said. Carefully, not too fast. I know how to do it, Marta said. She'd been on the frontier longer than he'd been alive. She put the lamp down and took Evelyn's arm and moved her toward the kitchen with the efficient authority of a woman who has dealt with worse things than this. Caleb carried Rose in and put her in her bed without waking her. He stood in the doorway of his daughter's room for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe, feeling the weight of the day settle across his shoulders. He'd been a widower for 3 years. Louise had died in the spring of 1880, and the time since had been a long process of learning what a household felt like when it was running on obligation and love and very little else. The love for Rose, which was large and uncomplicated, and the obligation to the ranch, which was large and very complicated and never finished. He'd managed. He was honest enough with himself to say it wasn't more than that most days. He'd managed. He went back to the kitchen. Evelyn was sitting at the table with a mug of something hot between both her hands and color coming back into her face. Marta was moving around the stove with the purposeful quiet of a woman who has decided not to ask questions until morning. "You should eat," he said, sitting down across from her. "I'm all right." That wasn't a question. She looked at him. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't categorize. Not gratitude exactly, not suspicion exactly, something in between, the look of a person who has had enough bad surprises to stay careful even when there's no immediate reason to be. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." "You would have froze." "I know." She looked down at the mug. "I was aware of that." "Most people in trouble are," he said. "Doesn't always make it easier to get out of it." Marta set a plate of cold biscuits and leftover beans on the table without comment. Evelyn ate. She ate like someone who was going to be disciplined about it, who wasn't going to let herself eat the way she actually wanted to, quickly, with both hands. She was a woman who was careful about what she let show. He could respect that. He'd been doing the same thing himself for 3 years. "You said you'd been here 6 days, he said, when she was halfway through the plate. "Yes, doing inventory work for Agnes." "Yes, 50 cents a day." She paused. "Which is not enough to buy a train ticket, as it turns out. Not in any time frame that felt reasonable." "You could work here," he said. She looked up. He hadn't planned to say it. He wasn't entirely sure why he had, except that he'd been running the house on Marta's help and his own and Rose's. And Marta was getting slower, and the house showed it, and there was always work that didn't get done. And there was something else he didn't examine too closely, something about the way Rose had said she looks like Mama, in that careful, trusting voice. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "The work is real. The house needs tending. She needs more than I'm giving her, and Marta's good, but she's not young. I can pay $1 a day and you'd have the room that used to be the hired man's room. It's small, but it's got a stove. In spring, if you want to leave, you'll have money to do it." She was looking at him with that careful, between-things expression. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know you walked back into a blizzard for your bag," he said. "That tells me something. I know you didn't ask me for help. You told me what your situation was when I asked. That tells me something else. It tells you I'm honest. People usually are when they're cold enough," he said. "But yes." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the storm pressed against the window glass and the stove ticked, and the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and beans, and the particular close warmth of a house that has been shut up against weather. "One night," she said finally, "I'll decide about the rest in the morning." He nodded. That was fair. He understood that from where she was sitting, any offer made by a man she didn't know was an offer that needed to be evaluated in the light. She stayed. Not because she'd made up her mind that first morning, not entirely. She stayed because the morning after the storm, when she came into the kitchen at 6 o'clock and found Rose already up and sitting at the table with a book she couldn't read, looking at the pictures with the serious concentration of a child who desperately wanted to understand them, something shifted. Rose looked up at her and said, "I can't read this one. Can you help?" And Evelyn sat down. And that was the beginning of something she hadn't planned. The room he'd offered her was small, as he'd said. The stove was functional but temperamental. The window faced north and let in a cold draft along the sill that she fixed in the first week by pressing strips of old cloth into the gap with a butter knife. The work was real, as he'd said. The house had been managed but not tended. There was a distinction, she was learning, between a house where people survived and a house where people lived. She wasn't sure what category this one fell into yet. She was starting to understand that the answer depended partly on her. She washed the curtains in the parlor, which had gone gray. She recaned the seat of the chair by the window that had given way sometime in the past year, using split willow branches from the creek bed that she soaked soft and wove herself, having watched her aunt do the same thing when she was 10. She reorganized the kitchen shelves so that the things most used were easiest to reach, a small change that made the mornings run differently. Caleb noticed. He didn't say much about any of it, but she could tell by the way he'd sometimes stop in a doorway and look at something for a moment before moving on, registering a change without marking it. He was a complicated man to read. He was not unfriendly, but he kept his distance in a way that was deliberate rather than cold. The distance of a person who had learned not to need things too quickly. He worked from before dawn to after dark most days. He ate dinner with them, with her and Rose and Marta, And he talked to Rose about her day, and to Marta about the weather and the stock, and to Evelyn about whatever needed discussing that was practical and immediate. He did not talk about himself, and he did not ask her questions she hadn't invited. She found this easier to live with than she expected. Rose was different. Rose was entirely open, the way 7-year-olds are before the world teaches them not to be. And she attached herself to Evelyn with a completeness that was both touching and slightly frightening. She wanted to know where Evelyn had grown up, and what her mother was like, and whether she'd ever seen a bear, and whether she thought the barn cat who'd just had kittens was going to let anyone touch them yet. She wanted Evelyn to hear her reading lessons and tell her if she was doing the letters right. She wanted Evelyn to braid her hair in the morning because Marta's fingers were stiff, and her father's attempts resulted in something that Rose described with judicial accuracy as a little bit of a disaster. "He tries," Evelyn said, the first time Rose said this. "I know he tries," Rose said, "but look at what I looked like at church last Sunday." She produced from somewhere a small mirror and held it up to show Evelyn the back of her own head. "I looked like a bird's nest." Evelyn looked. "It's not that bad." "Mrs. Keaton asked if I'd been outside in the wind." "What did you say?" "I said yes because I didn't want to make Daddy feel bad." Evelyn pressed her lips together to suppress a laugh. "That was kind of you." "I know," Rose said, with the serene self-satisfaction of a 7-year-old who has been told she's done something right. "Can you show me a braid that stays in? Daddy uses too much string and it doesn't work." She was teaching Rose to read, to braid hair, to sew a straight stitch. She was teaching her the names of the herbs she'd started growing in the kitchen window. Rosemary, thyme, mint, the seeds for which she'd traded with Mrs. Purdy, who had been more useful than the boarding house suggested. She was teaching her the difference between clouds that meant snow and clouds that were just thinking about it, which her own grandmother had shown her and which was not entirely scientific but was more accurate than it had any right to be. In return, without understanding that she was doing it, Rose was teaching Evelyn something harder to name, what it felt like to be needed in a way that was specific to you, what it felt like to have someone look for you when you came home. The weeks went by, the blizzard passed, and another came, and the winter settled into itself, the long structural cold that Montana does differently than any other place, not as crisis, but as condition. Evelyn sewed by the kitchen fire after dinner while Caleb worked at the table on the ledger books he always seemed behind on. Rose slept. Marta turned in early. The house was quiet in a way that was not empty. She had not stopped thinking about Cincinnati. She had not stopped thinking about the milliner's shop and her cousin and the life she'd set down and not picked back up. But the thinking was different now, not longing exactly. More like looking back at a photograph of a room she used to live in, recognizing it but not homesick for it. She was careful about this. She was careful about most things that involved feeling, because feeling had gotten her here wearing a wedding dress in a blizzard, and she was not in a hurry to make the same kind of mistake. But she was there, in that kitchen, in that house, and she was starting to understand that she was not, as she had initially believed, simply waiting to leave. The fever came for Rose in the 3rd week of February. There was no clear start to it, no single morning when the child was fine and then suddenly sick. It crept in the way illness does in winter, disguised as tiredness, as a runny nose, as the kind of general flatness that could be anything. Marta noticed it first. She said on a Thursday evening that Rose had not eaten much of her supper, and that she'd been quieter than usual. Caleb went in to say goodnight and came back looking like a man who'd just seen something he couldn't unsee. "She's warm," he said. "More than warm." Evelyn went in herself. Rose was lying on her side facing the window, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her face flushed a deep, wrong red. Her breathing was fast. Not struggling, not yet, but fast. "Hey, Bug," Evelyn said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I don't feel good," Rose said. It came out small and flat, none of her usual brightness in it. "I know. We're going to work on that." "Is it bad?" "You've got a fever," Evelyn said. "Fevers are not fun, but they're also not always bad. Your body's fighting something and making itself hot to do it." She smoothed the hair back from the child's forehead. "Are you cold?" "No, I'm hot. Can I have water?" She got water. She got a cloth and the basin of cool water from the washstand in her own room. She came back and found Caleb in the doorway of Rose's room, watching his daughter with the look of a man who has already decided he cannot afford to be frightened and is not managing it particularly well. "I'll sit with her," Evelyn said. "The doctor's in Mill Haven," he said. 20 miles. "I know. With this weather, the road could be—" "Caleb." She turned to look at him. "I know. Let me see what we're dealing with tonight before we make decisions about 20 miles in February." She paused. "I've brought someone through a fever before. My younger sister. She was 9. I know what to watch for." He looked at her. He was measuring something. She could see it. Not doubting her exactly, just the way a man measures when what's at stake is the only thing he'd die for. "Tell me if it gets worse," he said. "Wake me up. I don't care what time it is." "I will." He went. She sat with Rose. The night went long and difficult. The fever climbed before it declined. That was the hard part, watching it climb, keeping the cloths cool on the child's forehead, giving water in small amounts, keeping her talking when she wanted to sleep too heavily. Rose was a good patient, in the sense that she was honest about what she felt and didn't make it worse by panicking. She was also, at her worst, frightened in the transparent, unguarded way that children are frightened, and that was harder to watch than the fever itself. "Am I going to be okay?" Rose asked, somewhere past midnight. "Yes," Evelyn said, without hesitating. "How do you know?" "Because I've been watching you for 3 hours, and I know what the bad signs look like, and you don't have them." "What are the bad signs?" "I'm not going to list them for you at midnight when you have a fever," Evelyn said. "Drink some more water." "You're kind of bossy," Rose said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Drink the water." She drank the water. She drifted in and out. Around 2 in the morning, the fever broke. Not all the way, but enough. The flush softening, the child's breathing slowing toward something closer to sleep than agitation. Evelyn changed the cloth, sat back in the chair, and felt the tension go out of her shoulders in one long, slow exhale. Caleb appeared in the doorway. She didn't know if he'd slept. Probably not. "Better?" he said very quietly. "Better," she said. "Not done, but better." He came in and stood beside the bed, looking at his daughter's face in the low lamplight. Rose was asleep, her breathing deep and regular, the color in her face settling toward something more like itself. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way men say things they mean too much to say carefully, quickly, getting it out before the feeling got complicated. "She's a fighter," Evelyn said. "She did most of the work." "She had help." She didn't answer that. She looked at Rose sleeping and thought about her sister, age 9, burning up in a room in Cincinnati while their mother sat on one side and Evelyn sat on the other, learning how to measure a fever by touch, learning the difference between a breath that is working and a breath that is struggling, learning that some nights you could not do anything but stay. "Go sleep," she said. "I'll stay until morning. If anything changes, I'll come get you." He went. She stayed. Rose slept through until 7 and woke up weak and cross and hungry, which Evelyn recognized as a good sign. She made broth and toast and brought it in and sat on the edge of the bed while the child ate, slowly, with the careful focus of someone who has been ill and is not entirely sure yet that eating is a good idea. "You stayed all night," Rose said. "Yes." "Were you scared?" Evelyn considered this. "A little, not too much." "I was scared," Rose said. "I know. That's okay." Rose put down the spoon. She looked at Evelyn with the direct, serious expression she sometimes got, the one that was older than her face. "You're going to stay, right?" she said. "Not just today. I mean, here, at the ranch." Evelyn opened her mouth and then didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere right now," she said, which was true, and was not the same thing as an answer, and Rose was 7 and knew the difference. "But you might," Rose said. It was not quite a question. "I might," Evelyn said honestly. "I don't know. But I'm here now, and that's what matters right now." Rose thought about this. Then she picked up the spoon and went back to the broth, apparently deciding to accept it. She was, Evelyn was learning, a pragmatic child. She was also, Evelyn was learning, the kind of child who got under your skin without trying. Who made you aware, quietly and without announcement, that you were starting to matter to someone in a way that would have consequences for both of you? Evelyn sat on the edge of that bed in the slow February morning and listened to the ranch come awake around her. The sounds of Caleb in the kitchen, of Marta in the yard, of the stock in the barn, and the wind still moving across the roof. And she understood that the question of whether she was leaving was becoming more complicated than she'd planned for it to be. She wasn't sure yet whether that frightened her or not. She thought it might be both. Rose's fever did not disappear cleanly. It retreated the way bad things often do in Montana winters. Not all the way, not at once, leaving traces of itself behind like snow that melts in the sun and refreezes overnight. For 3 more days, the child ran warm in the evenings, cool enough by morning to seem recovered, then warm again by supper. And Evelyn held her schedule to it the way you hold a course by a compass you don't entirely trust but have no better instrument to replace. She slept in the chair in Rose's room the second night. The third night, when the child's temperature finally steadied and her appetite came back in full. Demanding, specific, she wanted the biscuits with the honey and not the other kind. Evelyn went back to her own room and slept for 10 hours without moving. She woke up stiff and disoriented and lay in the gray morning light staring at the ceiling of the small north-facing room, listening to the ranch noise filtering through the walls, and understood that something had shifted under her in the way of ground that has been moved by water. She hadn't planned to care this much. She'd thought she was past making that kind of mistake quickly. She got up. She did what she always did. She went to the kitchen. Caleb was already there, at the table with his coffee, the ledger open in front of him and a pencil behind his ear. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face, some held thing, released slightly at the sight of her. "She slept through," he said. "I know. I checked at 5. Evelyn moved to the stove, took the pot from the back burner. Her breathing was normal, temperatures down. "You didn't have to check at 5. "I know I didn't have to." She poured herself coffee and didn't look at him. "I woke up and I checked. It's not a complicated thing." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him close the ledger. "I've been trying to think of the right way to say thank you," he said. "I haven't found it yet." "You don't need to find it." "I know I don't need to. I want to." She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him across the kitchen. He was a man who looked better in daylight than in lamplight, she'd noticed. The lamplight made him seem harder than he was, flattened out the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into sun and wind, and not, she suspected, from anything particularly easy. In daylight, he was just a man sitting at a table with a ledger he was behind on, and a child he loved more than he knew what to do with. "She's going to be fine," Evelyn said. "That's the thank you." He nodded. He looked at the ledger without seeing it. "She asked me this morning," he said, "if you were going to stay." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. "I told her I didn't know," he said, "that it was your choice to make." That was the right answer. She didn't think so. He picked up the pencil, turned it over in his fingers, put it back down. "She's 7. She's decided you're staying, and she's waiting for the rest of us to catch up with her." "Children do that," Evelyn said. "They do," he said. "Sometimes they're right." She didn't say anything to that. She took her coffee and went to start breakfast, and he opened the ledger again, and the kitchen filled up with the ordinary sounds of a morning that was not simple but was, for the moment, manageable. That was February. March came in with a brief warm spell that fooled nobody, and then a hard freeze that lasted 2 weeks and tested everything on the property: pipes, stock, tempers. The north pasture fence that Caleb had been repairing when the first blizzard hit went down in a section, and he spent 3 days in weather that had no business asking anyone to work in it, stringing wire with hands that came in at night raw and stiff. Evelyn started leaving a pan of water on the stove when he was due back, not boiling, just warm, and he took to dipping his hands in it without being told and without making anything of the fact that it was there. Marta noticed. Marta noticed most things. She said nothing, which was itself a form of commentary. The household had settled into a shape that none of them had designed, but all of them had contributed to, the way a path gets made through a field, not because anyone planned it, but because everyone kept walking the same direction. Evelyn managed the house and Rose's education and a growing portion of the cooking, which had been Marta's domain, but which Marta surrendered with what Evelyn recognized as relief rather than resentment. Marta's hands hurt in the cold. Kneading bread was harder than it used to be. She still made the soup. She still managed the root cellar inventory with a system that only she fully understood and which Evelyn had learned not to interfere with. They worked around each other with a mutual respect that had never been stated and didn't need to be. Rose progressed. This was the only word for it. The child progressed at everything she put her attention to with a focused velocity that suggested she had been waiting for someone to pay sufficient attention to her capabilities. Her reading improved so quickly that Evelyn had to write to Agnes Coulter, who ordered books for the dry goods store, asking for anything appropriate for a child who had outpaced the primers. Agnes sent back 3, with a note that said, "I heard about the fever. Glad she's well. These are from my own shelf." Evelyn read the note twice and felt something warm and uncomfortable in her chest that she recognized as gratitude, which she'd been managing carefully enough that it surprised her when it arrived. Rose learned to sew a straight stitch and a blanket stitch, and then, without being taught, figured out by examination how to sew a cross-stitch, which she demonstrated to Evelyn with barely contained pride. "I looked at the pillowcase," she said, holding up a piece of flour sack fabric on which she had embroidered a lopsided but recognizable flower. "And I figured out how it goes." "You figured that out yourself?" "Mostly. I asked Marta what the stitch was called." "And she told you?" "She showed me on a piece of cloth and then said I needed to practice before I ruined good fabric." Rose held up the flour sack again. "This is practice fabric." "It's excellent practice," Evelyn said. "Do another one." Rose did another one. By the end of the week, she was doing them without looking down. Evelyn wrote to her cousin Margaret in Cincinnati. She'd written once before, shortly after arriving, a brief, controlled letter explaining that the situation had changed and that she was working at a ranch outside Harlan Creek and was fine. Margaret had written back with a length and warmth that suggested she had things to say that a letter couldn't fully contain, and ended with, "Are you truly all right? Don't lie to me in a letter, Evie. I'll know." Evelyn had been putting off the reply because she wasn't sure what she was going to say. She sat down in early March and wrote, "I am truly all right. I am not the same kind of all right I was when I arrived, which is a different thing from being worse. I think it might actually be better, though I am being careful about deciding that too quickly. There is a child here who is teaching me things I didn't know I needed to learn. There is a man here who I am trying not to think about too clearly, because the last time I thought about a man too clearly, it cost me considerably. The ranch is cold. The winters here make Ohio winters look like a rude suggestion. I am, against all reasonable expectation, not unhappy." She sealed the letter and gave it to Caleb to take to town, and did not reread it first because she knew she would change it if she did. Spring arrived in Montana the way it always does. Late, reluctant, and still carrying winter in its back pocket in case it needed it. The mud came first. The mud was categorical and serious, and turned the road into the ranch into something that required a horse to negotiate and a wagon to fight. Caleb lost one of the rear wheels of the wagon to a rut in mid-April, and spent an afternoon in language that Evelyn could hear from the kitchen, and that Rose listened to with the expression of a child storing vocabulary for later use. "What does that mean?" Rose asked about one particular phrase. "It means he's frustrated," Evelyn said. "But what does it mean?" "It means the wagon wheel came off," Evelyn said. "Go practice your letters." The thaw brought work in quantities that made winter look leisurely. Caleb was up before 4 most mornings and back after dark. And the hired men he'd taken on for the season, 2 brothers named Cotter and a quiet Scandinavian named Eric, who had been on the frontier for 6 years and communicated primarily through work, were present from sunup to sundown and still left things undone. Evelyn expanded the kitchen garden with seeds she'd been planting since February, negotiated with the woman 2 ranches over for a cutting from her rhubarb plant, and started keeping a household account book in the back of the ledger Caleb never quite reached the end of. She hadn't meant to do that last part. She'd just found herself tracking the prices at Agnes's store and the quantities they were going through and the places where things were being wasted or could be substituted, and at some point she'd written it down, and at some point it had become a practice. When Caleb found it, she'd left the ledger open on the table, not thinking. He stood reading it for a long time without speaking. "Some of this I'd been meaning to sort out for 2 years, he said. "The butter," she said, not looking up from the bread she was shaping. "You were buying more than you needed every month and losing most of it before it got used. I talked to Marta and we adjusted. And the coal oil." You were keeping the lamp in the barn burning all night when there's no one in there after 9. Half the quantity, nothing lost. He was quiet. I'm not trying to manage your ranch, she said. I see the numbers and I think about them. It's what I did at the shop. If it bothers you, I'll stop. It doesn't bother me, he said. He said it in a way that suggested it was the opposite of bothering him, in a way that was almost something else entirely. And then he closed the ledger and went back to work, and neither of them said anything more about it. There were moments like that, not frequent, not dramatic. Nothing in this house ran toward drama, which was one of the things about it that she had come to value. But there were moments that had an extra weight to them, a slight pause at the end, a thing said in a particular way that meant something adjacent to what was actually said. She was aware of them. She believed he was aware of them. They both proceeded as though they weren't, which was a form of honesty about the fact that neither of them was ready to deal with what they actually were. She thought about Douglas Hale less than she'd expected to. Not never. She thought about him sometimes in the particular way that you think about something that hurt you, the way you probe a tooth that aches to make sure it still does. But the ache had lost its sharpness. What replaced it wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was more like distance, the sense that the woman who had read those 17 letters and sewn that dress and stepped off that train into an empty platform was someone she could recognize but no longer be. Which was not entirely comfortable because that woman had believed things about herself that this woman was not certain of, and the uncertainty had not been replaced by its opposite, just by a different kind of knowing. She knew she could nurse a sick child through a Montana night. She knew she could walk back into a blizzard for something she needed. She knew she could make a household run on less than it thought it needed and feel better for it. These were not the things she'd thought she was coming west to discover about herself. They were the things she'd discovered anyway. What she was less certain about was what she was going to do with them. The question of leaving had not gone away. It had simply stopped presenting itself as urgent. The spring train ran through Harlan Creek starting in April, and she had money now. 2 months of wages, the $1 a day Caleb paid her reliably on the first of every month, which she kept in an envelope in the inner pocket of the carpetbag alongside her mother's brooch. It was not enough for the train fare and comfortable resettlement in Cincinnati, but it was close. By June, it would be enough. She had not told anyone she was calculating this. She was not sure she was calculating it toward action. She was calculating it the way you keep track of an exit in a building. Not because you're planning to leave, but because knowing it's there makes staying feel like a choice. One afternoon in late April, Rose found the wedding dress. Evelyn had taken everything out of the carpetbag to reorganize it, a thing she did every few weeks, with the focused attention of someone who does not have many possessions and therefore keeps track of all of them carefully. The dress was folded at the bottom, wrapped in the brown paper she'd folded around it that first night at Mrs. Purdy's. She'd set it on the bed while she reorganized, and she'd been called to the kitchen for something. And when she came back, Rose was sitting on the floor of her room with the brown paper in her lap and the dress unfolded across her knees, examining it with the thorough seriousness she brought to everything. "This is beautiful," Rose said. Evelyn stood in the doorway. "It's a wedding dress," Rose said. "Yes." "Did you wear it when you got married?" "I wasn't married," Evelyn said. She came in and sat on the edge of the bed. "I was going to be. The man I was going to marry changed his mind." She paused. "Or he'd already changed his mind before I arrived and just didn't tell me." Rose looked at the dress. She ran her finger along the seam at the shoulder, the flat, careful stitching. "You made this yourself," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "It must have taken a long time." 4 months, almost 4. Rose considered this with the gravity of a child to whom 4 months is a significant portion of life. "That's a really mean thing he did," she said, "to let you make a dress for 4 months and then not marry you." "It is," Evelyn agreed. "Are you still sad about it?" Evelyn thought about this honestly. "Not the way I was," she said. It's more like being sad about something you wasted than something you lost. The time. The believing." She looked at the dress. "The dress is still good, though. The dress didn't do anything wrong." "You should wear it again," Rose said. "To something good this time." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "You should wear it to your wedding," Rose said, with the casual certainty of a 7-year-old presenting an obvious solution. "I'd have to get married for that." "You could," Rose said. She looked up, completely matter of fact. Daddy doesn't have a wife. The statement sat in the room between them. Evelyn looked at this child, this small, serious, relentlessly direct child who had her father's jaw and apparently his habit of saying the most important thing in the room as though it were no particular weight to carry. Rose, she said. I'm just saying, Rose said. You're already here, and you already know where everything goes. That is not, Evelyn said carefully, how people decide to get married. I know. Rose folded the dress back along its creases, slowly, with more care than Evelyn expected. But you could think about it. She handed the folded dress back to Evelyn and stood up and went to find the barn cats. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed with the dress in her hands and the April light coming through the north window and the sounds of the ranch outside, and she thought that the problem with Rose Ashford was not that she said things she shouldn't. The problem was that she said things no one else was saying, and she was not wrong about them. She put the dress back in the carpet bag. She did not put it at the bottom this time. She put it near the top, in the way that you handle something you've decided is not finished. Caleb said nothing about the dress. She hadn't expected him to. He hadn't seen it, as far as she knew. But something between them changed in May in a way that she couldn't attribute to any single event. He started eating breakfast with them in the mornings, not just dinner. He started asking her opinion on things, not household things, not her domain, but ranch things, decisions about the cattle and the pasture rotation, and whether to take on a third hired man for the summer. He didn't always follow her advice. He listened to it. You know about cattle now? He said one evening after she'd suggested something about the rotation that he'd thought about and decided to try. I know about keeping accounts, she said. The grass is a resource. You're deciding how to allocate a resource. It's the same kind of problem. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite admiration, but was in the vicinity of both. Where'd you learn to think like that? He said. The milliner's shop, she said. Mr. Harton was not a good businessman. I was a good employee. After 3 years, I knew more about running it than he did, and he paid me $1.50 a week anyway because I was a woman, and it was 1882. That's a waste, he said. Yes, she said. It was. They were quiet for a moment. Rose had gone to bed. Marta had gone to bed. Outside, the May night was loud with insects and the distant sound of the creek running high with snowmelt. Why did you come west? He said. Really? Not hail. I understand the practical answer. But why did you say yes when he asked? He stopped, started again. You could have managed Cincinnati. She looked at the table between them. I wanted something that was mine, she said. Not the shop, not my cousin's spare bedroom, not the life I was inheriting by default because nothing better had presented itself. She paused. He made it sound like a choice, like I was choosing something, not just settling for the next available thing. She stopped. He lied about what I was choosing, but the wanting, that was real. What did you want it to look like? He said. Not unkindly, like a man who actually wanted to know. I don't know anymore, she said. What I thought I wanted and what I've ended up with are so different, I'm not sure they're related. Is that bad? She looked at him across the table. I'm still figuring that out, she said. He nodded slowly. Fair enough, he said. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the creek and thought about what she'd said, which was true, and what she hadn't said, which was also true, and understood that both of those things were going to have to be dealt with eventually. She just hadn't worked out in what order. The second week of May brought a problem with the South herd, and 3 days of Caleb barely home, and then a problem with the pump in the yard that Eric fixed with a part he fashioned himself from scrap iron. And then, on the 15th, a Saturday, the information that Douglas Hale had been seen in Harlan Creek. She heard it from Agnes, who came by the ranch on some errand related to a sewing circle Evelyn had been attending in town once a month. A thin pretext, but Agnes was a woman who liked to deliver things herself when the things were important. I thought you should know, Agnes said, standing in the kitchen doorway with her coat still on. Before you went to town and came across it unexpected. He's been there 3 days. No one knows why. Clara, his wife, isn't with him. Evelyn was at the counter making bread, and she did not stop. Is he staying somewhere? She said. Fenton's boarding house, not Mrs. Purdy's. I don't know if that's consideration or coincidence. Agnes paused. People are talking about whether he came back because of you. People can talk about whatever they like, Evelyn said. I have no business with Douglas Hale. He might think otherwise. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. What he thinks, she said, is not something I'm able to manage. Agnes looked at her for a moment, then at the kitchen, the reorganized shelves, the herb pots in the window, the household account book on the shelf beside the spice tins, the drawing Rose had made of the barn cats tacked to the wall beside the door. You've made something real here, Agnes said, quietly, not as a question. I've made something, Evelyn said. Real is, I'm still working on that part. After Agnes left, she stood at the counter with the dough under her hands and thought about Douglas Hale 3 days' presence in Harlan Creek and what it might mean. She thought about the 17 letters and the soft fold in the one she'd read so many times. She thought about the train platform and the cold and the specific humiliation of being left somewhere you don't belong, an address you made with your own hands, with no one stepping out to help. She was not the same woman who had stood on that platform. That woman had been operating on the belief that a man's word was a solid thing to build a future on. This woman knew better. This woman had built something with her own hands, not with a man's word, but with her own. And she was not interested in having that interrupted. But she was also not a woman who waited for things to come to her if she could help it. She'd learned that much, at least. She told Caleb that evening, not because she needed permission or protection. She was precise about that in her own head before she opened her mouth. She told him because they had gotten to a place where telling each other things was part of how the house ran, and keeping it from him would have been its own kind of dishonesty. He listened without interrupting, which was a thing she'd come to appreciate about him. You want to go to town? He said, when she finished. I want to know what he wants, she said. If he's going to make a problem, I'd rather meet it than wait for it. That's probably right, he said. I'm not asking for your... I know you're not, he said. I'm agreeing with you. He looked at her. I'd like to come. Not to speak for you, just to be there. She considered this. It was a carefully offered thing, and she recognized the care in it. All right, she said. They went to town the next morning. A Sunday. Rose stayed with Marta. Caleb hitched the wagon and they rode in mostly quiet, which was a comfortable quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling. The mountains were very clear and close the way they sometimes are in spring, the kind of clarity that makes distance feel smaller than it is. She didn't know if she would see Hale. She didn't know what she would say if she did. She knew that whatever it was, she would say it standing up in daylight, without shame, because she had nothing to be ashamed of, which was something she hadn't been entirely certain of when she was sitting on a bench in a blizzard wondering if she'd made the worst mistake of her life. She was certain of it now, whatever came next. Whatever Hale wanted, whatever the town was saying, whatever the shape of the thing that was building between her and Caleb in the evenings across that kitchen table, she was not the abandoned bride anymore. She was not the woman who could be left somewhere and forgotten. She had stayed. She had worked. She had brought a child through a fever and made a household remember itself and chosen every morning for 4 months to still be here. That was not nothing. She was beginning to understand very nearly everything. They did not see Douglas Hale that Sunday. He was not at Fenton's when they passed it, not at the feed store, not anywhere along the main street of Harlan Creek that Evelyn could identify. The town had that particular Sunday morning quality, quiet but not empty. People moving between the church and the boarding houses, and the handful of establishments that stayed open on the Sabbath because the frontier was not sentimental about business hours. She and Caleb walked the length of it without hurrying, stopped at Agnes's store, which Agnes opened for an hour on Sunday mornings as a courtesy to ranchers who couldn't make it in on weekdays, and bought coffee beans and a paper of needles and a bag of oats. Normal things. She said hello to the people she recognized, and they said hello back. And no one said anything about Douglas Hale, and the morning passed without incident. She told herself this was fine. She told herself she had not been prepared for a confrontation on a Sunday morning anyway, that it was better to have come to town and shown her face and gone home without drama. She told herself all of this on the wagon ride back, watching the mountains and keeping her hands in her lap. And Caleb said nothing, which meant he understood that she didn't want to discuss it, which was its own form of comfort. But the knowledge of Hale's presence sat in the back of her mind like a stone in a boot. Small, persistent, Impossible to ignore once you'd noticed it. He found her on Tuesday. She was at Agnes's store again, this time for the practical purpose of picking up the books Agnes had ordered for Rose. 2 primers from a publisher in St. Louis, and a thin volume of illustrated natural history that Rose had been asking about since February. She was at the counter paying when the door opened behind her and Agnes's expression changed in a way that told her everything before she turned around. Douglas Hale was taller than she remembered. Or perhaps she remembered him only from the daguerreotype he'd sent with his 4th letter. Formal, stiff-shouldered, the photograph of a man who had arranged himself to be looked at. In person, he was rangy, with a reddish beard she hadn't expected and the wind-roughed face of a man who worked outside. He was not bad-looking. She had known that from the photograph. It no longer seemed relevant. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved through his face. Surprise. And then a rapid resettling that looked like the effort of a man organizing an approach he'd already prepared. "Evelyn," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said. The formality landed the way she'd intended it to. His expression shifted slightly. "I heard you were out at the Ashford place," he said. "I worked there." She turned back to Agnes and finished the transaction, folded the paper with the books into her bag, and then turned to face him fully because looking away would have been a concession she wasn't prepared to make. "Is there something you needed?" "I'd like to talk," he said. "If you'd give me a few minutes." "I'm available for a few minutes," she said. "Here." He glanced at Agnes. Agnes had found something very interesting to do behind the counter that kept her facing the shelves, which both of them understood to mean she was hearing every word. "It doesn't have to be here," he said. "I prefer here." He set his jaw slightly. It was a small tell, and she noticed it. "All right," he said. He moved a few steps closer, lowered his voice to something that wasn't quite private, but was trying to be. "I know what happened when you arrived was, it wasn't handled well. I should have written, I know that." "You should have written," she said, "before you married someone else." "It was complicated." "I'm sure it was." "Clara's family had land that adjoined mine," he said. It was a business situation that became something else, and by the time I understood what it was, things had already—" He stopped. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." "Good," she said, "because I haven't." He looked at her with something she couldn't entirely read. It wasn't regret, exactly. It was the expression of a man who has been running a calculation and found it coming out differently than he expected. "The situation with Clara has changed," he said. She waited. It hasn't worked out the way either of us expected. Her family's land is in a legal dispute, and she's gone back to Billings to deal with it, and I don't know if she's coming back." He paused. "I'm not certain it's over, but I'm not certain it isn't." The store was very quiet. Outside, a wagon went past on the street. "I see," Evelyn said. "I wanted you to know," he said. "In case— I don't know. In case things change and I wanted to talk to you properly. I thought it was only right to be honest about where things stood before I—" "Mr. Hale," she said. She kept her voice level and her hands still at her sides. "I appreciate that you've told me this. I want to be equally honest with you, since you've raised the topic. I am not waiting for your situation to resolve. I am not a position to be reconsidered. I came here to marry you, and you had already married someone else, and I had $4 and a wedding dress, and I sat in a blizzard on a train platform because no one in this town felt obligated to step in." She paused. "I found my footing, not because of anything you did, in spite of it, and I'm not interested in having that interrupted." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face that she thought might have been genuine feeling. Shame, maybe, or the closest thing to it that a man like Hale could manage. "You seem different," he said. "I am different," she said. "Good day, Mr. Hale." She picked up her bag and walked out. On the street, she stood for a moment in the May sunlight and felt her heart going fast and her hands not quite steady, and understood that that was all right. That doing something difficult didn't require you to feel calm while you did it. That she had said what she meant, and meant what she said, and had not once looked for the door. She went home and told Caleb at dinner, because not telling him would have been a choice, and she was done making choices based on what was easier. He listened. Rose was at the table and listened too, her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "He came to ask you to wait for him?" Caleb said. "Not exactly. He came to establish that I was aware of his situation, in case you wanted to take up where he left off. More or less. Caleb's jaw tightened in a way that was brief and controlled. And you told him no. In slightly more words, yes. Rose put her fork down. He's the man who left you in the storm? He's the man I was supposed to marry who married someone else, Evelyn said. The storm was separate. But if he hadn't done that, you wouldn't have been in the storm, Rose said, with the airtight logic of a child who has been paying attention. That's true. Then it's his fault. Rose, Caleb said. It is, Rose said. She picked her fork back up. I don't like him. You've never met him, Evelyn said. I don't have to, Rose said with the finality of a 7-year-old who has arrived at a verdict and sees no point in relitigating it. Evelyn looked at her plate. She was not smiling exactly, but something in her chest that had been tight since Tuesday morning had loosened. The problem was that it didn't stay loose. Hale left Harlan Creek the following Friday. She heard this from Agnes, and she thought it was over. She thought she'd handled it. And it was done. She let herself believe this for approximately 10 days, until the middle of June, when the first whisper reached her through the particular underground telegraph that operated in small frontier towns, the one that traveled from front porch to dry goods counter to church step, without anyone being identifiably responsible for it. The whisper was she had come west husband hunting and hadn't found any takers, and had installed herself in the Ashford household under false pretenses, and was making trouble for herself with married men. She heard this version from Marta, who delivered it with the flat, factual effect of someone who considers it her duty to report intelligence regardless of its content. Who's saying it? Evelyn said. Nobody specific. Everybody a little. Marta poured herself coffee and sat down. It's the kind of thing that starts small and grows if nobody cuts it off. What would cutting it off look like? Marta looked at her steadily. Depends on where it started. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. He came back? Evelyn said. Somebody talked to somebody in Billings, Marta said. That's what I heard. Whether Hale is behind it, or it's just people with too much time and too little charity, I can't say. What Evelyn knew, what she understood, turning it over in the following days, was that it didn't actually matter which. The effect was the same either way. A woman alone, dependent on a widower's household, with a past that could be made to look convenient or calculating depending on which version you told. She'd known women ruined by less. She'd known women who never recovered from the particular damage that whisper campaigns do, which is not to destroy your circumstances directly, but to make everyone around you slightly uncertain about you, slightly watchful, so that your every action gets read through a lens of suspicion. She went to the sewing circle that month. She almost didn't. She stood in the kitchen the morning of and argued with herself. Going meant facing the watchful eyes and the careful silences, and not going meant confirming by absence whatever the whispers were saying. She went. It was not comfortable. There were 8 women in Agnes's back room, and most of them were the same women who had been there every month since March, and most of them behaved exactly as they always had. But 2 of them were different. Mrs. Keaton, whose husband ran the livery stable and who had always been friendly, was friendly in a way that had acquired a small, extra quality, a kind of heightened politeness that meant she was working at it. And Mrs. Driscoll, who had never been particularly warm, was openly cool in a way she hadn't bothered to be before. Evelyn sat with her needlework and said what she had to say, and listened when it was appropriate and left when it was over, and she drove herself home because she'd brought the small cart. And on the road she let herself feel the particular slow burn of anger that she'd been keeping banked all afternoon. Not at Keaton or Driscoll specifically, at the mechanism, at the specific efficiency of it, how little it took, how small a thing could be set in motion and then run on its own momentum, requiring no one to actively tend it, just a few well-placed uncertainties, and then people's own imaginations doing the rest. She told Caleb that evening. She had gotten into the habit of telling him things, and she was not going to stop because the things had gotten harder. He listened the way he always listened, quietly, with his attention fully on her, not preparing his response while she was still talking. "What do you want to do?" he said when she finished. "I want to know if Hale started it." "I can find out." "How?" "I can ask him." He said it simply, as though it were straightforward. "He's in Billings. I can send a letter, or I can ride there." "Caleb, he came into my house as business," he said, Into yours. That's not nothing. I don't want you to ride to Billings on my account. He looked at her. What if I want to? She didn't have an immediate answer to that. He let her not have one. Let me send the letter first, he said. See what comes back. In the meantime, you keep going to town. You keep going to the circle. You don't change anything you're doing because you've done nothing wrong. I know I've done nothing wrong, she said. The difficulty is that knowing it and having the town know it are two different problems. They are, he said, but you don't solve one by hiding. You solve one by staying present until the other catches up. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the June evening light and thought that for a man who spoke carefully and rarely offered opinions about things he hadn't been asked about, he was occasionally very clear. All right, she said. The letter went to Billings. No answer came back in the first 2 weeks, which was itself information. But something else happened in that time that was more immediately useful. Eric, the Scandinavian hired hand who communicated primarily through work, turned out to have one other channel. He talked to the other hired hands at neighboring ranches, in the way that men who say little to their employers say everything to their peers, and through this channel came the information that Hale had, in fact, been talking. Specifically, that he'd been describing Evelyn to anyone in Billings who would listen as a woman who had pursued him aggressively and made difficulties for him and his wife, and that her presence at the Ashford Ranch was something of a scandal that respectable people in Harlan Creek were increasingly uncomfortable with. Eric delivered this report to Caleb on a Thursday morning in the barn, and Caleb relayed it to Evelyn that evening without editorializing, in the same flat tone that Marta used for unwelcome intelligence, which she recognized as a specific form of respect. He's decided I'm the problem, she said. He's decided to make you the problem, Caleb said, which isn't the same thing, though it feels it. What's the distinction? One is true. The other is a choice he made. He put his coffee down. He's a man who's lost money, maybe lost a wife, and he's looking for something to turn outward. You're convenient. I'm convenient, she said flatly. You came from somewhere. You cost him something, not materially, but in his own estimation of himself. Men like that need somewhere to put that. She looked at her hands on the table. I didn't cost him anything, she said. He walked away from me. I was the one who paid. I know that, Caleb said. He knows it too. That's why he needs to rewrite it. She sat with that for a moment. He wrote me letters, she said. 17 of them. 4 months' worth of letters about a ranch and a life, and she stopped. They were good letters. That's the part I keep coming back to. They weren't the letters of a man who was lying the whole time. Some of it was real. Probably, Caleb said. That doesn't make the rest of it better. No, she said. It makes it more complicated. He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm with the long summer evening, the window open, the smell of grass coming through it. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes? When you think about him now, is it the man you're angry at? Or is it what you built around what he said? She looked at him. It was a careful question, the kind that had been sitting with someone for a while before it got asked. Both, she said. Mostly the second. She paused. I built things around words before I knew what the words were made of. I should have been more careful. Or you should have had better information, he said. That's not the same as not being careful. Careful doesn't protect you from someone who's deliberately not telling you things. She didn't say anything. He'd said something true, and she was letting it settle. You don't take much credit, he said, for what you've managed. I take credit for practical things, she said. The house, the accounts. Things I can measure. That's not all you've done here. She looked at him across the table. The evening light was doing something particular to the kitchen, the long horizontal light of a Montana June, coming in gold through the window, and he was sitting in it the way people sit in light when they don't know they're in it, unguarded. Caleb, she said. I'm not trying to make this complicated, he said. I just think you should know that what you've put into this place, into Rose, into all of it, I see it. It's not invisible. He stopped. That's all I meant. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the table. Thank you, she said, meaning it fully. The way you mean things when you've stopped performing what meaning looks like and are just doing it. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. They sat in the kitchen as the light changed and the evening came down, and the thing between them that had been building for months without either of them reaching for it was right there in the room, patient and present, neither of them quite ready to call it by its name. What changed everything was the letter, not Caleb's letter to Hale. That never received a reply, which confirmed what they already suspected without adding anything useful. The letter that changed things came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in July, delivered by the post rider who came out on the northern route twice a week. It was addressed to Evelyn in a handwriting she didn't recognize, with a return mark from the law offices of a man named Garrett in Billings. She opened it at the kitchen table with Caleb standing in the doorway, not pretending he wasn't watching. It was 2 pages. She read them twice before she said anything. "Hale is claiming breach of promise," she said. The kitchen was quiet. "He's claiming," she said, reading, "that I entered into a formal engagement with him, which I did, that part is true, and that upon my arrival in Montana I engaged in conduct unbecoming and refused to honor the terms of the engagement, causing him material and reputational damage." She set the pages down. "He's threatening to sue." Caleb came fully into the kitchen. He sat down across from her and looked at the letter without touching it. "He married someone else," he said. "He knows that. The letter—" She picked it back up, scanning. "The letter argues that Clara Finch pursued him and that the marriage was conducted under duress from her family and that the prior engagement to me should therefore still be considered binding and that my refusal to honor it and my subsequent—" She looked for the phrase, "inappropriate cohabitation in an unmarried man's household constitutes a breach." She put the letter down again. "He's lost his mind," Caleb said. "He's not lost his mind," Evelyn said. "He's calculated. He's a man who's lost a land deal and possibly a marriage, and he's looking for something to recover from it. If he sues me and wins, and it's not impossible, Caleb, breach of promise cases go the way juries want them to go, and a jury of men in 1883 Montana might find it very plausible that I did something wrong. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know, but he could make it look like I did. He could put me in front of a judge and describe me as a woman who came west to find a husband and installed herself in a widower's home and involved herself in his finances and his child's upbringing. And it would not take much imagination for a certain kind of man to find that narrative convincing." She paused. "He doesn't have to win. He just has to make the attempt, and the attempt is enough to damage everything I've built here." Caleb was looking at her with an expression that was working hard at being calm and not entirely succeeding. "Then we fight it," he said. "With what? I don't have money for a lawyer." "I do." "Caleb." "Evelyn." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not. "He came after you because he thinks you're alone, because he thinks there's nothing here to push back against. I'm not going to let him be right about that." She looked at him across the table. She wanted to say she didn't need him to do this. She wanted to say she could manage it herself, find some other angle, some other approach. She wanted to say it the way she'd been saying versions of it for months, because needing things from people was something she was still learning to allow herself. But he was right, and she knew he was right, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in being talked out of it for her sake rather than his own. "All right," she said. "I know a man in Helena," he said. "A lawyer. He's good. He's dealt with worse than a breach of promise threat from a man who married someone else." "Hale married someone else," she said, for the 3rd time, because it still had a kind of baffling quality to her, the sheer audacity of it. "He actually married another woman, and then he's going to stand in front of a judge and claim I breached something." "He is," Caleb said, "and we're going to make sure the judge knows exactly in which order all of that happened." He stood up. He took the letter from the table and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll ride to Helena at the end of the week," he said. She started to say something. She stopped. She looked at this man, this careful, deliberate, quietly forceful man who had stopped a wagon in a blizzard and made a decision that had changed both their lives and had not once, in all the months since, made her feel like she owed him for it, who kept his distance in all the ways that mattered, and closed it only when there was a reason, who was standing in his own kitchen with someone else's legal threat in his pocket, already thinking about what to do next because it was the right thing, and because she was something to him that neither of them had named. "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her. "To Helena," she said. "It's my fight. I'm not going to sit here while you ride to Helena to manage it." A pause. Rose would need to stay with Marta. Marta can manage 4 days. Another pause. Shorter. All right, he said. Then, after a moment, you should know. Going to Helena together will give people something to talk about. People are already talking, she said. At least this time what they're saying will be true. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but was related to one, the expression of a man who finds something both serious and, in some private way, good. Fair enough, he said. They told Marta that evening. Marta received the information about the trip and the lawsuit and the planned journey with the same measured affect she brought to everything, refilled her coffee cup and said, "He's a fool." "He's a calculating fool," Evelyn said. "That's worse." "Calculating fools make mistakes," Marta said, "because they think they know more than they do." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "You know more than he thinks you do." It was possibly the most direct thing Marta had ever said to her. Evelyn thought about it that night, lying in her small north-facing room, listening to the summer sounds of the ranch, the horses in the barn, the creek, the vast, undifferentiated sound of a Montana night that was nothing like the night she'd known anywhere else. She thought about what Hale had calculated. He'd calculated a woman alone. A woman without resources, without standing in the community, without anyone who would publicly vouch for her. He'd calculated that her position at the Ashford Ranch was fragile enough that the threat of legal action and social disgrace would be sufficient to… what? To make her go away, probably. To remove the inconvenience of her continued existence in the same territory as his. He had miscalculated in several directions. He had miscalculated Caleb, who was not a man who shrank from things. He had miscalculated Agnes, who had been quietly and consistently on Evelyn's side since February, and who had reach in this town that Hale apparently didn't understand. He had miscalculated Marta, who knew where every account book was and what every number meant, and who could speak to the nature of Evelyn's time at the ranch with the authority of someone who had watched it unfold day by day. And he had miscalculated Evelyn herself, which was, she thought in the dark, the most satisfying of all the things he'd gotten wrong. He'd looked at a woman who'd arrived in a blizzard with $4 and a wedding dress and assumed that woman was still what he was dealing with. He hadn't accounted for what 4 months of hard work and a child's trust in a kitchen that she'd made run better, and a household account book, and a long winter and a longer spring had done to the woman he thought he knew how to manage. She was not managed. She was not waiting. She was not afraid. She was in fact looking forward to Helena. She fell asleep with her hands folded over the blanket and the night sounds around her and the morning somewhere ahead, already thinking about what she was going to say when she finally had the opportunity to say it to a man who was paid to listen. Helena was 2 days' ride from Harlan Creek, which meant 1 night on the road, which meant decisions about arrangements that neither of them discussed directly, but both of them had clearly thought about. Caleb handled it the way he handled most things that had social weight, practically, without making it strange. He knew a family 15 miles outside Helena, the Wardles, who ran a cattle operation and kept a spare room for travelers. He sent a letter ahead. There was no conversation about propriety or appearances. There was just the practical fact of the thing, arranged and settled. Evelyn packed a bag the night before they left. She stood in her small room and considered what she owned and chose carefully, the way she'd always chosen carefully with limited resources. Her good dress, the dark blue wool, not the cream traveling dress she'd worn on the train, which she still associated too strongly with arriving somewhere and finding nothing there. Clean underthings. The household account book, because the lawyer might want to see it. The original letters from Hale, all 17, which she'd kept in the carpet bag since February, not out of sentiment, but out of the same instinct that made her keep receipts. She'd known, somewhere below thinking, that they might be useful. Rose was awake when she went to say goodnight, sitting up in bed with the natural history book open in her lap and an expression on her face that was working very hard at not being worried. 4 days, Evelyn said, sitting on the edge of the bed. I know. Marta knows where everything is. I know where everything is too, Rose said, with a dignity that was slightly undercut by the fact that she was wearing a nightgown with a rabbit on the pocket. I'm not a baby. No, Evelyn agreed. You're not. Rose looked at her book. Is it because of the man? She said. The one from the letter? Evelyn had not told Rose about the letter's specific contents, had not told her the word lawsuit, or the phrase breach of promise, none of the legal architecture of what Hale was attempting, but Rose was not a child who missed much. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He's made some claims that aren't true, and we're going to talk to someone in Helena who can help us deal with them." "We," Rose said. "Your father and I." Rose looked at the book again. "He said you're not in trouble," she said. "I'm not. It's more like someone is trying to make trouble, and we're going to make sure they can't." "Can they?" Evelyn considered giving the comfortable answer. "I don't think so," she said, which was the true one. "But I'm not going to pretend I know for certain, because I don't, and I think you're old enough for the honest version." Rose absorbed this. She had the quality when she was thinking seriously of going very still, all her usual motion suspended, like a bird on a wire. "Okay," she said. Then, "Come back." "I will come back," Evelyn said. 4 days." "Okay," Rose said again. She looked back at her book with the air of someone who has closed a subject. Then, without looking up, "Evelyn." "Yes." "I'm glad you stayed. From the beginning. I'm glad you stayed." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. It was a simple thing to say, and it landed with all the weight of a simple thing said by someone who means it without complication. "So am I," she said. She bent and kissed the child's forehead and went to finish packing. They left at first light. The July morning was warm already, the kind of warmth that had weight to it, and the road south out of Harlan Creek ran through country that opened up gradually. The valley widening, the mountains pulling back on either side, the grass long and seed-heavy in the fields they passed. Duke had been spelled by Caleb's other horse, a younger gray mare named Kit, who was faster and less philosophical about her work. They made good time. They talked, on and off, not constantly. Caleb was not a man who filled silence for the sake of it, and she'd long since stopped being uncomfortable with that. They talked about the lawyer, a man named Whitfield, who had been recommended by a rancher Caleb trusted, who apparently had a reputation for being unsentimental and effective. They talked about the accounts she'd brought and whether they would be relevant. They talked about the ranch and the south pasture, and the thing Eric had noticed about one of the fence posts that needed addressing when they got back. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, with the mountains visible and the road straightening out ahead of them, Caleb said, "I want to ask you something, and you can tell me it's none of my business." "All right," she said. "When this is over, when Whitfield deals with Hale and it's settled, what do you want?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Not what you're planning, what you actually want." She looked at the road, too, for a moment. "I want to stay," she said. If it's something that makes sense, I want to stay at the ranch and keep doing what I've been doing. I want to watch Rose learn to read properly and see the garden through to fall." She paused. "I want what I've already got, which I know is not a very ambitious answer." "It's an honest one," he said. "What do you want?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Same," he said, "and more than that. But I'm not going to put that on you before we've dealt with Hale, because it would feel like I was making use of circumstances." She looked at his profile. The line of his jaw, the slight squint he had against the afternoon sun, the way he held the reins, loose enough to give Kit her head, firm enough to correct if she needed it. "Caleb," she said. "It can wait," he said. "It's waited this long." She thought about arguing. She decided he was probably right, for reasons she could acknowledge even if they frustrated her. She looked at the road ahead and the mountains and the long summer light and thought that there were worse things than having something to come back to. They reached the Wardells before dark. The family was hospitable in the way of frontier people who understand that roads are long and help given freely comes back around. A good dinner, a warm spare room, no questions about the nature of the trip or the relationship between the two travelers beyond what was immediately obvious. Evelyn slept well, which surprised her, and woke at 5 feeling clear-headed and purposeful. Whitfield's office was on the second floor of a building on Helena's main street, above a land surveyor's office, reached by an external stair that squeaked on every step. He was a compact man in his 50s, with a gray beard kept short, and an office so full of papers stacked in systems that only he apparently understood that Evelyn felt an immediate, involuntary professional sympathy. He looked at her, and then at Caleb, and then back at her with the expression of a man beginning to take measurements. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start with the letters." She told him everything. She put the 17 letters on his desk in chronological order and walked him through them and then told him about the arrival, the platform, the blizzard, the boarding house, the dry goods store, the ranch. She told him about Hale's visit in May and the conversation at Agnes's counter. She told him about the lawyer's letter and its specific claims. She told him what she knew about the situation with Clara Finch and the land dispute. Whitfield listened without interrupting. He made notes. He picked up several of the letters, read sections, put them down. The argument he's making, he said when she finished, is not legally insane. I want you to understand that. Breach of promise cases have been won on weaker grounds than this, in the wrong courtroom, in front of the wrong jury. I understand that, she said. However, he said, his position has a problem that I suspect his lawyer in Billings has not adequately explained to him. He picked up one of the letters, the one from October, the one about counting the weeks. He established an engagement. He then, while that engagement was active, married another woman. Under Montana territorial law, that is not merely a violation of the engagement. It constitutes what we would argue is a unilateral dissolution. He dissolved the contract. He cannot subsequently claim that you breached it. He set the letter down. The question is how his lawyer intends to argue around that. He's claiming the marriage to Clara Finch was under duress, Evelyn said, that her family pressured him. Whitfield looked at her with an expression that suggested he had significant experience with this particular category of claim. Do you have any reason to believe that's true? He said. No, she said. I think he wanted her land and married her for it, and it didn't work out the way he planned. That is almost certainly what happened, Whitfield said. And if we can demonstrate it, which depends on whether Clara Finch or her family is willing to speak to it, or whether any documentation of the land arrangement exists, then his duress argument falls apart. He leaned back. There's also the matter of the reputational campaign. What you've described, the whispers, the story circulating about you in Harlan Creek, if we can establish that he's the source, that becomes a separate cause of action. Defamation. Which changes the posture of this considerably. He wants to sue me, Evelyn said. You're saying we could sue him. I'm saying that if he understood that was the terrain he was walking onto, he might reconsider the entire undertaking. Whitfield folded his hands on the desk. Men like Hale make these moves because they expect the other party to fold. The most effective response, in my experience, is to make folding look less attractive than stopping. Caleb, who had been sitting slightly back through all of this, present, attentive, not interjecting, said, "What do you need from us?" "The letters, which you've brought. The account records from the ranch, which I understand you've also brought. Those establish the legitimacy of Miss Mercer's position in the household, which goes to his cohabitation claim. And I need the name of anyone in Harlan Creek who can speak to her character and to the sequence of events as they actually occurred." "Agnes Coulter," Evelyn said immediately. "She owns the dry goods store. She hired me the week I arrived, and she's seen everything since. Marta Hendricks, who manages the Ashford household, she's been there for years, and she's not a woman who says things she doesn't mean." She paused. "And Gruber, the station master. He was on the platform when I arrived. He knew about Hale's marriage, and he said nothing. He won't want to testify to that, but if he's compelled to, he can confirm the timeline." Whitfield wrote the names. "Good," he said. "That's a strong foundation." He looked at her directly. "Miss Mercer, I want to be clear about the likely outcome. If we respond to Garrett's letter formally and make it clear we are prepared to countersue and to call witnesses, I believe Hale will withdraw. He is not in a financial position to sustain a legal fight. The Finch land dispute has apparently cost him considerably. He's making this move from weakness, not strength, but I can't guarantee it. If he proceeds, we proceed, and we have a very good case. But courts are courts." "I understand," she said. "You're not frightened," he said. It was an observation, not quite a question. "I'm frightened," she said. "I'd be a fool not to be. But I'm not going to let being frightened change what I do." She paused. "He's counting on me being more frightened than I am. I'd rather he found out he miscalculated." Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Something passed between the two men that was brief and not entirely readable, but which seemed to involve a mutual understanding of something. "I'll draft the response to Garrett's letter today," Whitfield said. "You'll have a copy before you leave Helena. I'd like you to review it, Miss Mercer, before I send it. It will make specific claims about events you witnessed, and I want your confirmation that they're accurate." "Of course," she said. They were in his office for another 40 minutes, going through details, and then they were back on the external stair that squeaked on every step, and then they were on Helena's main street in the July heat. Evelyn stood for a moment on the sidewalk with her bag over her arm and the sun on her face and felt the particular quality of air that follows something difficult being handled. Not over, not yet, but moving in a direction. "You all right?" Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "I think yes." "You want to eat? There's a decent place 2 streets over." "Yes," she said, and meant that too. They ate at a table by the window and talked about nothing complicated for an hour. The food, which was better than either of them had expected, the street outside, a disagreement they'd apparently had about whether Kit was actually faster than Duke, or just younger and therefore more willing, which turned out to be an argument they could have at length without resolving. She ate more than she usually let herself eat in public, because she was hungry and because something about the afternoon had loosened a constraint she hadn't known she'd been maintaining. They went back to the Wardells. The evening was long and warm. She sat on the porch after dinner and watched the light go out of the sky in stages, and Caleb came and sat in the chair beside her after he'd helped with the horses, and they were quiet together in the way they were quiet on the wagon and at the kitchen table and in all the spaces of the day that had accumulated over months into something that had its own specific texture. "He said you weren't frightened," Caleb said. "I told him I was." "I know, but the way he said it—" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I don't think he's seen many women in that chair who weren't." "He probably hasn't seen many women in that chair at all," she said. "True." She looked at the darkening sky. "I'm tired of being careful," she said, not bitterly, just as a fact. "I've been careful for months, careful about what I feel and what I say and what I let myself want. And I understand why. There were good reasons, but Hale sending that letter and going to Helena and sitting in that office and laying everything out, it made me think about what I'm actually doing." Das ist possamis, she paused. "I don't want to spend the rest of this year being careful about the same things I was careful about in February." Caleb was looking at the sky too. "I said it could wait," he said. "You did," she said. "I'm saying it doesn't have to." He turned to look at her. She looked back. The porch was quiet. Inside the house there were sounds. The Wardell family, children's voices, something being washed up in the kitchen. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that going in. I didn't handle things well with Louise the last couple of years, and I know that, and I've thought about it more than I should probably admit." He stopped. "I'm not saying that as an excuse. I'm saying it because I don't want to hand you something and have you not know what you're taking." "I know what I'm taking," she said. "You're not as complicated as you think you are." He looked at her. "That might be the least flattering thing you've ever said to me." "It wasn't meant as an insult," she said. "It means you're honest. It means what you do matches what you are. That's rarer than you think." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I've been thinking about asking you something since March," he said. "I kept finding reasons not to. The timing wasn't right. Hale was a problem. You deserve to get through one thing before I put another thing in front of you." "And now?" she said. "Now Hale's being handled," he said, "and I'm sitting on a porch in Helena and I've run out of good reasons to wait." She waited. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not a question exactly, the way he said it, more like a statement that required her confirmation. Not because of Rose, though Rose would, not because of any practical reason, though there are plenty. Because you're the person I want in the chair next to me. Because the house is different with you in it, and I'm different with you in it, and I don't want to go back to what either of us was before. The porch. The darkening sky. Inside, the sound of children and water and ordinary life. "Yes," she said. She said it the way she'd answered Whitfield when he asked about her situation. Plainly, without hedging, because she'd already had the longer internal conversation, and the answer was the same from every direction she'd examined it. His exhale was not quite steady, which was one of the most human things she'd ever seen from him. That's, he started. Yes, she said again, a little more firmly, because he looked like he might feel the need to say something elaborate and she'd rather he didn't. That's the answer. It doesn't need anything added to it. He looked at her. Then for the first time in the 6 months she'd known him, he laughed. Not his usual brief, contained thing, but something fuller, surprised out of him. All right, he said. They sat on that porch until the stars were properly out. Neither of them said much. Neither of them needed to. The return to Harlan Creek happened in stages. Whitfield's letter went to Garrett and Billings 3 days after their visit. It was, Evelyn thought when she read it, a masterwork of legal precision. It laid out the timeline of events with the specificity of a man who had read 17 letters carefully, addressed the duress claim with a pointed summary of the documented land transaction between Hale and the Finch family, which Whitfield had apparently located through court records, and closed with notice that his client was prepared to pursue defamation claims with specific damages enumerated should Garrett's client choose to proceed. They were back at the ranch by the time the letter had been sent. The house felt different when they came back to it. Or she did, standing in the kitchen doorway with her bag still in her hand, looking at the shelves she'd reorganized and the herbs on the window and the account book on its shelf. Rose appeared from somewhere at a velocity suggesting she had been listening for the wagon, and she launched herself at Evelyn with the unselfconscious force of a child who doesn't calculate these things, and Evelyn caught her and held on. 4 days, Rose said, muffled against her shoulder. 4 days, Evelyn confirmed. Rose pulled back and looked at her face with the thoroughness of a person checking something. Whatever she saw apparently satisfied her, because she nodded once, like an inspector approving a report, and went to see about the horses. Telling her came that evening after dinner when Marta had gone to her room and it was the three of them in the kitchen. Caleb told it, simply, without ceremony, because ceremony was not how this household operated, and Rose would have found it suspicious anyway. I asked Evelyn to marry me, he said. She said yes. Rose looked at her father, then at Evelyn, then back at her father. I know, she said. You know, he said. I could tell when you came back, she said, with the serene authority of a child who considers this obvious. You both look different. Different how? Evelyn said. Rose considered this with appropriate seriousness. Less like you were trying to figure something out, she said. There was a pause in which both adults recognized that a 7-year-old had stated the situation more accurately than either of them could have. Are you happy about it? Caleb said. Rose looked at him. Yes, she said. Obviously. Then to Evelyn, I told you you could think about it. You did, Evelyn said. You were right. I know, Rose said, and went back to her biscuit. Marta was told the next morning. She received the information, poured herself coffee, sat down, and said, Good. Now maybe someone will finish patching that roof section before October, which was Marta's way of saying she was pleased. The answer from Billings came 3 weeks later. It was not from Garrett, it was from Hale directly, which was either a sign that Garrett had declined to continue representing him or that Hale couldn't afford the ongoing fees, and either way it confirmed what Whitfield had said about his financial position. The letter was 2 paragraphs, written in the slanted handwriting she had once read so carefully in a spare room in Cincinnati, and it said that he was withdrawing his legal claim and expected no further correspondence on the matter. No apology. No explanation beyond the withdrawal. She hadn't expected either. She stood at the kitchen table with the letter in her hand for a moment. Then she walked to the stove and put it in. She stood there watching it go and thought about the woman who had stood on the platform in December and looked up and down the length of it for a man who wasn't there. She thought about the 17 letters and the soft fold in the one she'd read too many times. She thought about all the care she'd put into something that turned out to be built on someone else's convenience, and the particular education of finding out what you're actually made of when that thing collapses. She was made of more than she'd known. That was the plain fact of it. The fire took the letter in about 40 seconds. She closed the stove door and turned back to the kitchen, and there was bread to make, and accounts to go over, and a child somewhere on the property who would want lunch in an hour. And Caleb was in the south pasture dealing with the fence section Eric had flagged, and Marta was in the root cellar doing the quarterly inventory, and none of it was simple or finished or without its complications. But it was hers. She had built this with her own hands. Not the wedding dress version of it, the version she'd stitched in someone's back bedroom in Cincinnati on the basis of a man's words. But the actual version, the one made of days and choices and difficult nights and small, accumulated decisions to keep going. No one had handed it to her. No one had promised it to her and then delivered something else entirely. She had arrived in a blizzard with $4 and a dress she'd sewn herself and no one stepping forward to help. She had stayed. She had worked. She had decided every morning since December that she was not leaving until she had something real. And she had built the real thing with her own hands, and the man who had tried to take it from her had looked at what she'd built and decided it was too solid to knock down. She found out later that afternoon from a rider passing through who'd come from the direction of Billings that Hale was said to be courting a widow in the territory east of Billings who had a reasonable property and no particular knowledge of his history in Harlan Creek. She heard this and felt nothing much, a mild, distant contempt that had no edge to it. He was someone else's problem now. He had always, she supposed, been going to be someone else's problem. She'd just been the one standing in the wrong place when he was looking for a solution. That Sunday, the third week of July, she went to the sewing circle at Agnes's. It was the first one since before Helena. She arrived at the same time as always, with her needlework in the bag her mother had given her, and she sat in the same chair she always sat in, and when Mrs. Keaton arrived and the air had that same careful quality it had had for weeks, Evelyn looked at her directly and said, "I imagine you've heard things have been sorted out." Mrs. Keaton looked at her. "I heard something to that effect," she said. "Good," Evelyn said. "I'm engaged to Caleb Ashford. We'll likely marry before fall. I thought people should know before they heard it in parts." The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something real has been said into them. Agnes, from her chair in the corner, made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. Mrs. Driscoll, who had been the cooler of the two, looked at Evelyn with an expression that went through several stages before settling on something that was not quite an apology, but was adjacent to it. "Congratulations," she said, in the careful tone of a woman who is doing the right thing and knows it. "Thank you," Evelyn said, with the kind of straightforward warmth that didn't rub the discomfort in. The circle went on. The needles moved. The conversation settled back into itself. Evelyn sat and stitched and listened and contributed and felt the shape of the room accommodating her the way a room accommodates someone who has decided they belong in it and stopped waiting for permission. On the ride home, with the afternoon light long across the grass and the mountains clear against the sky, she thought about the wedding dress at the bottom of the carpet bag. Near the top now, where she'd moved it that afternoon in April, when Rose had found it and said with the certainty of a child who doesn't see why things should be complicated that she should wear it to something good this time. She was going to need to take it out and look at it properly, see what condition it was in after 6 months folded in a bag. See what needed mending. She suspected it would hold. She had made it to hold 4 careful months of stitching in a room in Cincinnati, building something she believed in with more care than the situation had turned out to deserve. That wasn't the dress's fault. The dress had been made well. The dress was ready. It had just been waiting, like everything else worth having, for the right time. She took the dress out on a Monday morning in late July, when the house was quiet and Caleb was in the north pasture and Rose was doing her reading at the kitchen table with the focused solemnity she brought to anything she'd decided mattered. Evelyn carried the dress to her room and spread it across the bed in the flat morning light and looked at it the way you look at something you made a long time ago, with a mixture of recognition and distance, the way your own handwriting looks slightly foreign after years. It had held up better than she expected. The wool had not moth-eaten. The seams were still clean. The collar still lay flat the way she'd worked so hard to make it lie. There was a small stain near the hem, pale gray-brown, from the snow on the platform in December. She'd forgotten about that, or set it aside with everything else from that day. There was a loose button at the left cuff, the thread gone thin, which she could fix in 10 minutes. The hem on the right side had a pulled stitch, barely visible, but she saw it because she'd put every stitch in herself and knew exactly where they all were. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the dress in her lap and thought about the woman who had made it. That woman had been operating on belief. Not naivety exactly. She hadn't been a naive woman, had understood more about the practical difficulties of what she was doing than she'd let herself consciously acknowledge. But belief? Yes. The specific kind of belief that makes you put 4 months into something, Because you've decided that if you care enough, if you do it carefully enough, if you make the thing well enough, it will be met with equivalent care on the other end. The world had corrected that assumption in a very direct way. What she'd learned, not from Hale, not from the platform, not from any single thing, but from the accumulated weight of the months since, was something she was still finding the right words for. It had to do with the difference between what you build on someone else's word and what you build with your own hands. It had to do with the fact that the second kind is harder and slower and has no guarantees either, but when someone tries to knock it down, it doesn't go. It had to do with staying. Not because you had nowhere else to go. She'd had somewhere to go. She'd calculated the train fare every month and could have gotten there. But because you'd looked at what was in front of you and decided it was worth the difficulty of being present for it. She picked up her sewing kit and started on the loose button. Rose appeared in the doorway sometime during the second verse of a song Evelyn hadn't realized she was humming. "Is that your dress?" she said. "Yes." Rose came in and stood beside the bed, looking at it with the thoroughness she brought to things she was genuinely interested in. "It's pretty," she said. "I forgot how pretty it was." "It needs a little work," Evelyn said. "But you're going to wear it." "Not a question. I'm going to wear it." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then, in the careful tone she used when she was approaching something important sideways, "Will I get to have a different dress? For the wedding?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "We'll make you one." "Can I pick the color?" "Within reason." Rose considered this. "What's the most reasonable color?" "What color do you want?" "Blue," Rose said. "Dark blue, like your winter dress. Not a baby color." "Dark blue is a reasonable color," Evelyn said. Rose sat on the edge of the bed beside her, carefully, not disturbing the dress. She picked up a corner of the fabric and rubbed it between her fingers the way she did with textiles she was evaluating. "Evelyn," she said. "After you and Daddy get married." She stopped and started again. "What do I call you?" Evelyn set down the button and the thread and looked at the child beside her. Rose was looking at the fabric, not at her, which meant she was more uncertain about this than she was letting show. "What do you want to call me?" Evelyn said. Rose was quiet for a moment that stretched out in a particular way. "I called her Mama," she said. "My real mother." A pause. "I don't really remember her voice anymore. I remember her hands. She had small hands." She turned the fabric over. "I don't want to... I'm not trying to replace... Rose," Evelyn said. Rose looked up. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," Evelyn said. "There's no wrong answer. If you want to call me Evelyn, that's fine. If you want to call me something else, that's fine too. You don't have to decide today." Rose looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the dress. "I think," she said slowly, "that there can be more than one." She seemed to be working something out as she said it. Like, she was my mama and she's gone. And that's what she was. And you're here, and you're different. You came out in the storm and stayed and taught me to read properly and sat with me when I was sick. She paused. "I think maybe your mom." The distinction was careful and precise, and Rose had clearly been thinking about it for some time. Evelyn looked at this child, this small, serious, relentlessly thoughtful child who had appeared on a wagon bench in a blizzard and held out half a blanket with the straightforward generosity of someone who doesn't yet know to be guarded about such things. Who had said she looks like Mama in the dark and changed the course of several lives without knowing she was doing it. "Mom works," Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Rose nodded with the air of someone who has handled a complex matter to everyone's satisfaction. Then she stood up. "I'm going to finish my reading," she said. "Can we measure for the dress tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Evelyn said. Rose went back to the kitchen. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed with the half-repaired dress in her lap and the July morning around her and felt the specific quality of something that has been building for a long time finally arriving. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way the light comes up in Montana, gradually and then fully, and then so completely that you can't quite remember what it looked like before. She went back to the button. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of September, which gave the summer time to finish its business and the ranch to get through the first stage of the fall work before anyone needed to think about gatherings and preparations. Agnes offered her store's back room for the reception, which was practical and generous, and the two women spent an August afternoon walking through it together. Agnes, with a measuring tape and the focused energy of a woman who treats logistics as a personal challenge. Evelyn with a notebook and the same. "You don't want anything elaborate," Agnes said. It was not a question. "No," Evelyn said. "Good. Elaborate is a lie. Simple done well is better." Agnes measured the back wall. "Tables along here? Flowers from Hendrick's place if she'll cut them?" "She will. She likes you." "Food?" "I'll handle the food," Evelyn said. Agnes lowered her measuring tape and looked at her. "You'll cook your own wedding food?" "I'll cook with Marta," Evelyn said. "Between us we can feed 30 people without losing our minds." 30 people, Agnes said. "So you're expecting the town?" "I'm expecting whoever comes," Evelyn said. "Some of them weren't sure about me 6 months ago. I'm not going to make it smaller to make them comfortable." Agnes looked at her for a moment with an expression that Evelyn had come to recognize as Agnes's version of approval, which manifested as a complete absence of argument. "Tables along here, then," Agnes said, and kept measuring. Marta, informed of the plan to cook for 30, said, "We'll need more rhubarb." "I'll get it," Evelyn said, "and the venison needs to be started 2 days before, or it won't be right." "I know," Marta looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about food for 30 people since July," Evelyn said. "Yes," Marta nodded. She had the look of someone who has found a colleague and is too private to say so directly. The dress came together over August evenings, in the kitchen after dinner, Evelyn working on her own and on Rose's blue dress both, planning them together, fitting them together, the two projects intersecting in the evenings when the work was done and the lamp was lit and Caleb was at the table with his ledger and the sounds of the ranch settled around them. Rose submitted to fittings with variable patience. Standing on the footstool Marta used to reach the high shelves, and reporting on her own measurements with great precision and strong opinions about the placement of the waistline. "Lower," Rose said during the second fitting. "It's at your natural waist," Evelyn said around the pins in her mouth. "My natural waist is lower," Rose said. "It isn't. It feels lower. You're 7. I'll be 8 in November." "Your natural waist will be in the same place in November," Evelyn said. "Hold still." Caleb from the table said nothing, but she could hear in his silence that he was smiling. These were the evenings she thought about later, when she tried to identify the architecture of what they'd built. Not the dramatic moments, not the blizzard, or the fever, or the legal letter, or the porch in Helena, but these. The ordinary work of an ordinary evening in a house that had decided to be a home. Rose on the footstool, Caleb at the ledger, Marta's chair empty because she'd gone to bed, the lamp casting its particular circle of light, the night outside big and dark and not frightening. The specific weight of being exactly where you are, neither waiting to leave nor afraid of staying. She had wanted, back in Cincinnati, something that was hers, a life she'd chosen rather than inherited by default. She'd imagined it would come through a man's word and a train ticket and a new country. It had come through all of those things, but in none of the ways she'd expected, sideways, through difficulty, through a blizzard and a child's fever and a confrontation at Agnes's counter and a lawyer's office in Helena and a porch in the dark and a simple answer given without hesitation because there was no other honest answer to give. The thing she'd wanted had arrived. It just hadn't looked like anything she'd planned. September came in clean and cool, the nights beginning to turn, the grass going gold at the edges of the fields. The mountains sharpened the way they do in fall, the distances shortening, everything seeming closer and more definite. The ranch was busy with the pre-winter work, fencing, stores, the careful arithmetic of what the stock would need and what the larder had to hold, and Evelyn moved through it all with the competence of someone who had learned the rhythms of this place over 9 months of close attention. She could read the sky now the way her grandmother had taught her to read weather. Though the Montana version required its own education, the cloud formations were different. The mountains changed everything. What was true about Ohio winters was only approximately true here. She'd learned by watching, by asking, by the particular embarrassment of being wrong enough times that getting it right started to feel earned. She knew which fence sections were weakest and needed attention before the first hard freeze. She knew which of the stock were reliable and which needed watching. She knew which neighbors could be called on and which were best left to their own affairs. She knew the account books well enough that she could see the year's shape in the numbers, the places where they'd come close, and the places where they had margin. She knew this ranch the way you know a place you've chosen to stay in, not visited. That was a different kind of knowing. The day before the wedding, she sat in her room with the dress laid out on the bed and looked at it in the afternoon light. It was the same dress, same wool, same seams, same flat-lying collar that had taken her 3 attempts to get right. The stain at the hem had come out with cold water and patience. The button was resecured. The pulled stitch was invisible now. She thought about the woman who had folded this dress to the bottom of a carpet bag in Mrs. Purdy's back room, wrapping it in brown paper with the careful hands of someone putting away a thing that had failed. She thought about moving it back near the top, that April afternoon after Rose had found it and said the obvious true thing that no one else was saying. She thought about all the mornings between then and now, when she'd opened the bag for something else and seen it there and known it was waiting without pressure, patient, as something that understands it's still relevant. You don't waste a thing you made with that much care. You find it the right occasion. Marta knocked on the open door. "Come in," Evelyn said. Marta came in and stood for a moment looking at the dress on the bed. She had never, in 9 months, commented directly on the dress or its story, the way she'd never commented directly on most things she understood completely. "It's good work," she said. "Thank you." Marta sat in the chair by the window, Evelyn's reading chair, the one she'd moved to the window in January for the light. She sat in it with the authority of a woman who has worked in a house long enough to sit anywhere in it. "I've been in this house for 8 years, Marta said, "since a year after Louise died." She was looking out the window, not at Evelyn. "It was a sad house when I came, not broken. Caleb doesn't break, that's not his nature, but sad the way places get when something that should be there isn't." She paused. Rose was 4. She needed someone to talk to her like she was worth talking to, not just someone to make sure she ate and slept. Evelyn looked at her. "You talk to her like she's worth talking to," Marta said. "You always did, from the beginning." She turned from the window. "I want you to know that I noticed, that I thought it mattered." "It does matter," Evelyn said. She's remarkable. Whatever she is, she didn't get it from the air." "No," Marta said. "She got some of it from her father and some of it from a mother she barely remembers, and some of it she built herself." She paused. "And some of it, this year, she got from you." They looked at each other across the room. Marta was not a woman who said unnecessary things, which meant that everything she'd just said was exactly what she meant to say, no more and no less. "Thank you," Evelyn said, meaning it all the way down. Marta stood up. "I'm starting the venison in the morning," she said. 6 o'clock. Don't be late." "I won't," Evelyn said. Marta went. Evelyn sat with the dress in the afternoon light and let the quiet settle around her. The morning of the wedding was cool and bright, the sky that particular shade of September blue that looks like it was put there by someone who was trying to make a point. The venison had been started at 6, as promised. The house smelled like wood smoke and rosemary, and the particular fullness of a kitchen preparing for more people than usual. Rose was awake before anyone, which surprised no one. She appeared in the kitchen at 5:30 in her nightgown with her hair already half braided in a way that suggested she had been attempting it herself and needed assistance. "I couldn't sleep," she announced. "I know," Evelyn said. "Can we do the rest of my hair now?" "After breakfast." "I'm not hungry." "Rose." "Fine," Rose said, and ate half a biscuit with the focused resentment of someone who knows they've lost the argument. Caleb appeared at 7, which was late for him, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the organized chaos of food preparation with an expression that was trying to be useful and not quite finding the opening. "Is there something I should be doing?" he said. "You should eat," Evelyn said, "and then you should go get ready, and then you should stay out of this kitchen." "I'm not in the kitchen." "You're in the doorway of the kitchen. It's the same." He looked at her, the direct warm look that had replaced his careful measuring one somewhere around the 3rd month, the one she'd stopped pretending she didn't look for. "You're calm," he said. "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm busy. Those are different things." "You look calm." "I have 30 people coming and a venison roast that has 3 hours left and a 7-year-old who hasn't eaten properly, and I need to do both our hair before noon," she said. I am the opposite of calm. I'm just not demonstrating it. He smiled. The full one, not the partial one. She'd learned to tell them apart. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she said. Eat something. He ate. He went and got ready. He stayed out of the kitchen. The guests came in the late morning, the way people come to things in small frontier towns. Not all at once, but in a gradual accumulation. Families arriving in wagons, neighbors who hadn't seen each other since summer, children running ahead of their parents across the dry grass. Agnes came early to help with the final arrangements and moved through the back room of her store with the efficiency of a woman executing a plan she'd been refining in her head for 6 weeks. Mrs. Keaton came and brought her husband and her 2 oldest children and said to Evelyn before the ceremony, simply and without elaboration, "I'm glad for you." "Thank you," Evelyn said, and meant it without reservation, because she had decided some time ago that she was not going to spend the next decade holding careful accounts of who had been uncertain about her and when. People were uncertain. It was a human condition. What mattered was what they did when the uncertainty resolved. Mrs. Driscoll came too, which Evelyn had not entirely expected. She sat in the second row and held her hat against the September wind and did not say anything before the ceremony, but after, she put her hand briefly on Evelyn's arm as she passed and said, "You've done well." It was not effusive. It was also clearly genuine, the compliment of a woman who doesn't give them cheaply. The ceremony was short because neither of them wanted it to be long. The justice of the peace was a man named Aldrich who had been doing this work for 12 years and understood that the point of the ceremony was not the ceremony, but the thing it marked, and he kept accordingly to the essential. Caleb stood beside her in his good suit and said what he meant without stumbling over it, which was exactly what she expected of him. She said what she meant clearly, looking at him while she said it because there was no reason to look anywhere else. Rose stood beside them both, in the dark blue dress that had required 4 fittings and considerable negotiation about the waistline, holding a small bunch of late summer wildflowers that she had picked herself that morning from the creek bank, and which were already slightly wilted but which she held with great dignity regardless. When Aldrich finished, Rose looked up at Evelyn with an expression that held several things at once: joy and seriousness, and the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched something she believed in come true. "Mom," she said, just that, testing it in the open for the first time. It landed the way words land when they've been exactly the right ones. Not dramatically. There was no drama in it, no performance. Just the weight of a true thing being said out loud by someone who had chosen it carefully. "Yeah," Evelyn said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she did not try to make it so. "That's me." Rose nodded, satisfied, and went to find the barn cats she had been told were not invited, but had come anyway. The afternoon opened up into one of those September days that Montana occasionally produces as evidence of its own generosity. Warm enough to be outside, cool enough to be comfortable. The light going golden by 3 o'clock and staying that way. The mountains a clean line against the sky. People ate and talked, and the children ran between the tables, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a harmonica, and the music was not professional but was enthusiastic and nobody minded. Evelyn stood at the edge of it and watched it and thought about belonging, not the concept of it, not the aspiration to it, but the specific, actual, physical experience of being in a place that holds you. She had not felt it in Cincinnati, where she had been present and functional and well-regarded but never quite rooted. She had not felt it in Mrs. Purdy's back room or at the dry goods counter, or in any of the early weeks when she was calculating exit fares and calling what she was doing temporary. She felt it now. Standing in Agnes's back room with the September light coming through the windows and Caleb across the room talking to Eric about something involving the fence, and Rose visible through the doorway, chasing the barn cats with a determination that suggested she had forgotten she was wearing a dress, and Marta sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee watching everything with her usual expression of comprehensive understanding, she felt it. The specific gravity of a place that knows you. The particular piece of being somewhere you chose, and that chose you back. Agnes came to stand beside her. "Are you happy?" Agnes said. Agnes was not a woman who asked this question rhetorically. Evelyn thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Yes," she said. "Not in the way I thought I wanted to be. Better." Agnes nodded. Better is how it usually goes, she said, when it goes right. They stood together watching the room, and after a moment Agnes went back to managing the food situation, which was her preference, and Evelyn stayed where she was a little longer. She thought about the dress. She was wearing it, the cream wool, the flat collar, the seams she'd put in by oil lamp in Cincinnati, with her fingers aching and her belief intact. It was the same dress, the same stitches, the same wool, the same 4 months of care. What had changed was not the dress, but the occasion, which was what Rose had said it needed and which Rose had been right about, because Rose was usually right about the things that mattered most. The woman who had made it had believed that careful work would be met with careful care. She had not been wrong about the value of careful work. She had been wrong about the source of the care. It didn't come from a man's letters. It came from her own hands, from her own decisions, from the long, unglamorous work of being present for something day after day until it became real. That was the lesson, if you wanted to call it one. Though she was wary of lessons, wary of the way they flattened experience into something you could carry in your pocket, too tidy for what the actual living of it felt like. But if there was a thing worth naming, it was this. You cannot build your worth into someone else's valuation of you. Not a man's proposal, not a town's approval, not the ease with which you are accepted by the people who had first been uncertain. Your worth is not located there. It is located in the doing, in what you made and how you made it, and what it cost you, and what you did not surrender when it was tested. She had come to Montana looking for a husband and found a blizzard. She had found, inside the blizzard, a wagon stopping and a child holding out half a blanket, and a man who looked at a woman in danger and made a decision without calculating what it would cost him. She had found, inside that decision, a household that needed her, and inside the household, herself. A version of herself she had not had access to before, the one who knew how to stay. Staying was the thing. Not because endurance was a virtue in itself, she had no patience for the idea that suffering quietly was something to aspire to. But because the things worth having are built slowly, in ordinary time, through the repetition of small choices to remain present and engaged with what is in front of you. You do not find a home. You make one, every day, out of the decisions you make about what deserves your attention and your care. Caleb came to stand beside her. He had extracted himself from the fence conversation, and he had his own cup of coffee, and the expression he wore when he was content but not saying so because he was not a man who announced his contentment. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. He stood beside her. They looked at the room together, at all the people in it, at Rose, who had now acquired one of the barn cats and was carrying it with the triumphant air of someone who has won a negotiation she was told she couldn't win. "She's got the cat in here," Caleb said. "I see that. You're not going to do anything about it." "It's her wedding too," Evelyn said. "More or less." He made a sound that was definitively a laugh. She felt it beside her, the warmth of it, the ease, not the ease of something that has always been simple, but the ease that is the other side of difficulty, the ease you earn. She thought about the train platform in December, the blizzard, the specific quality of that cold, which she did not think she would forget for as long as she lived. Not as a bad thing, not anymore, but as the ground state of everything that came after. You cannot know what warmth is worth without having been genuinely cold. Not philosophically cold, actually physically cold, with the light going and no one stepping forward and your legs shaking and the terrible simplicity of understanding that you are in real trouble. She had been in real trouble. She had survived it. And then, more importantly, she had stayed to see what came after the surviving, which turned out to be the real work, the work nobody talks about, the work of building something in the place where you were almost lost. The afternoon light shifted. The fiddle started up again. Rose abandoned the barn cat, who left with dignity and came to stand beside Evelyn and take her hand with the naturalness of something that has always been true and is only now being said out loud. "Mom," she said conversationally as though trying it again. "Can I have more of the venison?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "With the gravy?" "With the gravy." Rose went. Caleb watched her go with the expression fathers have when they love their children so much it is almost embarrassing, and they have given up trying to hide it. "She's going to ask for a barn cat in the house," he said. "She already asked me," Evelyn said. "Last week." "What did you say?" "I said that the barn cats are for the barn, And the house cat, if we have one, should come from a different litter, so there's no confusion about anyone's role. He looked at her. So we're getting a house cat. Apparently, she said. He shook his head, but he was smiling, and the smile stayed, and the afternoon went on around them, warm and ordinary and entirely, stubbornly real. Later, much later, after the guests had gone and Agnes had been helped with the cleaning, and Rose had been carried home asleep in the wagon with the barn cat somehow in her arms despite everyone's agreement about barn cats being for barns, Evelyn sat on the porch of the ranch house in the September dark. The stars were out in the Montana way, which was excessive, the sky too full of them for someone raised under city skies to feel entirely natural about. She had never gotten used to this sky. She suspected she never would, which seemed right. Some things should keep their capacity to astonish you. She sat in the chair beside the one Caleb would take when he came out, which he would, because he always did in the evenings when the house had settled. The chair that had become hers in the slow, unannounced way that things become yours when you keep returning to them. She thought about the envelope in the carpet bag with her mother's brooch and the train fare money she'd never spent. She would take it out tomorrow and think about what to do with it. Maybe put it toward the house cat. Maybe put it into the account book in some category she hadn't made yet. Maybe just move the brooch to a drawer where it could be looked at rather than kept away. Because keeping things away as protection against loss was a habit she was trying to change. The door opened and Caleb came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside her and gave her one, and she took it, and they sat in the dark together under the excessive stars. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she said. They sat. The night was large and quiet, and around them the ranch breathed. The horses in the barn, the creek, the wind moving through the grass in the south pasture where the fence had been repaired and was holding. She had come west in a wedding dress, looking for a life she'd been promised. She had found, instead, a blizzard and an empty platform and a man and his daughter who had stopped a wagon and made room. She had found, inside that accident of timing and cold weather, and a child who said she looks like Mama in the dark, the thing she'd actually been looking for. Not the version she'd imagined, not the life assembled from someone else's letters, but the actual thing, built from her own hands and her own choices in her own ordinary time. She was not who she'd been in December. She was not going to be ever again. And the woman she was sitting on this porch, holding this coffee, in this particular darkness, with this particular man beside her, and a 7-year-old asleep inside who had called her mom twice today and would again tomorrow and every day after. That woman was not the consolation prize for the plan that had failed. She was what the plan had failed in order to become. The stars were extraordinary. The coffee was good. Somewhere in the barn, the cats were going about their business. She stayed.